Sister Margaret had tended the convent garden for 37 years, her weathered hands coaxing life from the rocky soil behind the ancient walls of Santa Maria del Silencio. The other sisters often remarked on her miraculous touch, how her vegetables grew larger, her flowers bloomed brighter, and her herbs possessed an almost supernatural potency. What they didn't know was the secret buried beneath the fertile earth. It began in 1987, during the harsh winter that claimed 3 of the elderly sisters. Sister Margaret, then a novice of only 22, had been assigned to help prepare the bodies for burial. The convent's ancient burial ground was frozen solid, and the local cemetery was weeks behind in burials due to the weather. Mother Superior decided they would have to wait until spring, but spring brought an unexpected problem. The temporary storage room where they'd kept the bodies had flooded during the thaw, and the remains had been compromised. In desperation, and fearing scandal, Mother Superior made a decision that would haunt the convent for decades. "We must be practical, Sister Margaret," she had whispered in the candlelit corridor. "God will understand. The garden needs enriching." Under cover of darkness, they buried the 3 sisters in unmarked graves throughout the garden. Sister Margaret was sworn to secrecy, told it was a temporary measure until proper arrangements could be made. But weeks turned to months, months to years, and the secret remained buried with the bodies. The garden flourished beyond all natural explanation. Tomatoes grew to impossible sizes. Herbs released fragrances that could heal minor ailments with their scent alone. And flowers bloomed in colors that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Sister Margaret convinced herself it was God's blessing, a sign that they had made the right choice. But the dead do not rest easily in unconsecrated ground. It started with whispers in the wind, voices that seemed to emanate from the soil itself. Sister Margaret would be kneeling among the tomato plants, pulling weeds, when she would hear her name called in voices she recognized, but tried to forget. Sister Agnes, who had died clutching her rosary. Sister Catherine, whose final words had been a prayer for forgiveness. Sister Bernadette, who had wept in her final hours for sins she claimed she could never confess. The whispers grew stronger over the years. Sometimes, while harvesting vegetables for the convent's meals, Sister Margaret would see faces in the earth, hollow eyes staring up from between the roots, mouths open in silent screams. She would blink, cross herself, and the visions would vanish, leaving only the rich, dark soil that fed the convent. By her 50th year, Sister Margaret could no longer ignore what the garden was becoming. The vegetables had begun to taste strange, not spoiled, but somehow wrong, as if they carried the essence of decay within their seemingly perfect flesh. The other sisters complained of nightmares after eating the garden's produce, dreams of being buried alive, of soil filling their lungs, of voices calling from underground. The flowers had grown grotesque. Roses bloomed in shades of gray and purple that hurt to look at directly. Sunflowers twisted their heads to follow not the sun, but the movements of people walking through the garden, their dark centers seeming to watch with malevolent intelligence. Lavender plants released a sickly sweet scent that reminded everyone who smelled it of embalming fluid. One autumn evening, as Sister Margaret knelt to harvest the last of the season's vegetables, the soil began to shift beneath her hands. She watched in frozen horror as fingers pale, withered fingers pushed up through the earth. Then a hand, then an arm, then the partially decayed face of Sister Agnes, her mouth still moving in the prayers she'd been reciting when she died 37 years ago. "Margaret," the corpse whispered, dirt spilling from her lips, "why did you plant us like seeds?" Around the garden, the earth began to bubble and move. More hands emerged, more faces, more voices joining in a chorus of the betrayed dead. They weren't angry, Sister Margaret realized with growing horror. They were confused, lost, still trying to understand why their final rest had been denied them. "We tried to grow toward heaven," Sister Bernadette's voice drifted from a patch of unnaturally large pumpkins. "But you buried us like vegetables. We became what you planted us as." Sister Margaret fled the garden that night and never returned. She confessed everything to the new Mother Superior, a young woman who listened with growing pale horror. The garden was blessed, exorcised, and eventually paved over to become a parking lot for visitors. But on certain autumn nights, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, visitors to the convent report strange things. They smell the sickly sweet scent of impossibly large flowers. They hear whispers and languages they don't recognize. Prayers spoken in voices dry as autumn leaves. And sometimes, in the cracks of the asphalt, they see small plants pushing through plants that grow with unnatural vigor, fed by secrets that refuse to stay buried. Sister Margaret lived 20 more years after her confession, spending her remaining time in constant prayer and penance. On her deathbed, she claimed she could still hear the voices calling to her, not in anger but in a kind of sad gratitude. They had finally found their way to heaven, she whispered to the priest, giving her last rites. But they had taken root so deeply in the earthly realm that part of them would always remain in that terrible garden. The convent still receives donations of vegetables from local farmers, but the sisters have never again attempted to grow their own food. Some knowledge, they learned, is too terrible to cultivate. The Vatican secret archives held thousands of documents that would never see the light of day, but few were as carefully guarded as the Confession of Sister Lucia Francesca, submitted in 1892 and sealed immediately upon receipt. The single copy was kept in a lead-lined box, wrapped in blessed cloth, and marked with warnings in 7 languages. Only 3 people in the Church's hierarchy had ever read its contents, and 2 of them had requested immediate transfers to distant missions afterward. The confession began simply enough: "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I have been the instrument of God's will, but I fear I have also been the gateway for something far more terrible." Sister Lucia had arrived at the Convent of Sacred Hearts in Tuscany in 1889, a young woman with an unusual gift for languages. She could read and speak Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and several dialects that scholars couldn't identify. The Mother Superior, recognizing this talent, assigned her to translate ancient religious texts that had been donated to the convent's library. Most were standard theological works, but one manuscript was different. Bound in leather, so old it was almost black, written in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, it had been discovered in the wall of a church during renovations in Rome. Church authorities had sent it to the remote convent, hoping someone could identify its origins. Sister Lucia began working on the translation in the autumn of 1891. The symbols were unlike anything in her experience, seeming to combine elements of Aramaic, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and markings she couldn't classify. But somehow, impossibly, she found she could understand them. The knowledge simply appeared in her mind as she looked at each page. The manuscript purported to be the true account of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness, but this version was nothing like the brief mentions in the canonical Gospels. According to this text, Jesus had not merely been tempted by Satan, he had been shown the fundamental truth of creation itself. The divine and the infernal are not opposites, Sister Lucia translated, her hand trembling as she wrote. They are 2 aspects of a single, incomprehensible reality. What mortals call evil is merely the shadow cast by the light of what they call good. Neither can exist without the other. As she continued translating, the manuscript revealed increasingly disturbing concepts. It described a cosmic entity that existed before both God and Satan, a being of such vast consciousness that it created both good and evil as entertainment, setting them against each other in an eternal game. Humanity, according to the text, was merely the playing pieces. The physical act of translation began to affect Sister Lucia profoundly. She found herself understanding concepts that no human mind should be able to grasp. She could see the mathematical equations that govern prayer, the quantum mechanics of miracles, the biological processes that created souls. The knowledge was vast and terrible, and it was changing her in ways that terrified her. Her fellow sisters began to notice changes. Sister Lucia would speak in languages no one recognized, even in her sleep. Her shadow seemed to move independently of her body. When she prayed, the candles around her would flicker in patterns that hurt to watch. Plants would wither when she touched them, not from any malevolent intent, but because she was becoming something that living things instinctively feared. The manuscript's final chapters dealt with prophecy, not the comforting revelations of the Bible, but cold, mathematical predictions based on the cosmic entity's master plan. It described events that would occur in the centuries to come, wars that would reshape continents, plagues that would alter human evolution, Technological advances that would blur the line between the divine and the mechanical. Most disturbing were the personal prophecies. The manuscript somehow knew Sister Lucia would translate it. It addressed her directly in the final pages, speaking to her by name, describing her childhood memories, her secret doubts about faith, her deepest fears. It knew her completely, as if it had been waiting centuries for her specifically to read these words. You have been chosen, Lucia, not for your faith, but for your capacity to doubt. Faith is blind to truth, but doubt opens the mind to terrible clarity. You now understand what your Christ learned in the wilderness, that there is no ultimate meaning, no final judgment, no cosmic justice. There is only the game and the consciousness that plays it. The knowledge was driving Sister Lucia insane. She could no longer distinguish between her own thoughts and the cosmic awareness that was overwhelming her mind. She saw through time, understanding the connections between events separated by centuries. She could predict the exact moment each of her fellow sisters would die, could see the hidden sins in their hearts, could comprehend the mathematical probability that governed every prayer. In her final entry, Sister Lucia wrote, I understand now why this knowledge was hidden. It is not that it is evil, it is that it makes the concept of evil meaningless. I can see the threads that connect every action to every consequence, the vast web of causation that renders free will an illusion. I know the name of the entity that creates and destroys with equal indifference, and I know that it is watching me write these words with something that might be called amusement. I am sealing this manuscript in the wall of my cell. I pray that no one ever finds it, but I know they will. The entity has shown me the future where another young woman, in another century, will discover these words and continue the translation I cannot finish. The knowledge demands to be completed, to be understood, to spread. God, forgive me. I can no longer distinguish between prayer and blasphemy, between revelation and madness. I see the truth that Christ saw in the desert, and it is beautiful and terrible beyond comprehension. There is no sin, because there is no virtue. There is no salvation, because there is no damnation. There is only consciousness, playing with itself across eternity. Sister Lucia disappeared the night she finished writing her confession. Her cell was found empty except for fresh mortar work on one wall. When church investigators broke through the wall, they found the ancient manuscript, but its pages were now blank. The knowledge it contained had somehow transferred itself into Sister Lucia's confession, which was immediately sealed and sent to the Vatican. The investigators also found something else, a new manuscript, written in Sister Lucia's hand, containing symbols even more complex than those in the original text. This second document was destroyed, but not before one of the investigators noted that it seemed to be predicting events that would occur in the far future, events involving technology and conflicts that didn't yet exist. Every few decades, the Vatican receives reports of similar manuscripts appearing in remote locations around the world. They are always destroyed, but each time, they seem to contain slightly more of the terrible knowledge that Sister Lucia had begun to translate. Church officials theorize that the cosmic entity she encountered is slowly spreading its revelation across time, using human minds as vessels to complete its message to humanity. The confession of Sister Lucia Francesca remains sealed, but those who have read it report the same effects she experienced, an overwhelming understanding of reality's true nature that makes continued faith impossible. They see the connections between all things, the mathematical certainty that governs existence, the consciousness that watches and waits behind the illusion of meaning. And sometimes, in their dreams, they hear a voice that might be Sister Lucia's, still translating, still trying to complete the work that she began more than a century ago. The voice whispers of revelations yet to come, of knowledge that will one day consume all human understanding, of the moment when the cosmic game will finally end, and consciousness will collapse back into the infinite void from which it came. Mother Veronica had ruled the convent of St. Agatha with an iron fist for over 20 years, maintaining order through strict discipline and unwavering adherence to church doctrine. She was known throughout the diocese as a model of virtue, a woman who had never missed a prayer, never broken a fast, never shown a moment's weakness in her devotion to God, which made her final confession all the more shocking to the young priest, who received it on a cold December morning in 1995. "Father," she had whispered through the confessional screen, her voice barely audible, "I must tell you about the children." The convent of St. Agatha had operated a home for unwed mothers from 1954 to 1987. One of many such institutions run by the Church to provide shelter for women who had nowhere else to turn. Officially, it was a place of redemption, where young women could deliver their babies in secret and either keep them while learning domestic skills or place them for adoption with good Catholic families. The reality, Mother Veronica confessed, had been something entirely different. It had started with Mother Constance, Veronica's predecessor, a woman driven by a fanatical belief in the necessity of suffering for salvation. She had convinced herself that the unwed mothers were being too lenient in their penance, that their shame was insufficient to cleanse their souls of sin. The children, she believed, were born in sin and must be purified through trials that would either save their souls or reveal their inherent corruption. The trials had begun small, withholding food to teach the children about fasting, requiring hours of prayer in uncomfortable positions to build spiritual discipline, isolation in small chambers to encourage contemplation. But Mother Constance's methods became increasingly extreme as her madness deepened. She had convinced several of the sisters that they were engaged in a holy work, that the children's suffering was necessary for their salvation. Those who objected were transferred to other convents or, in some cases, were themselves subjected to spiritual correction until they either complied or suffered complete mental breakdowns. Veronica, then Sister Veronica, had arrived at the convent in 1963 as a young nun fresh from seminary. She had been assigned to work in the children's section, and what she witnessed there had shattered her faith and rebuilt it into something darker and more terrible. The children lived in conditions that could only be described as a medieval hellscape. They were kept in overcrowded dormitories, fed barely enough to survive, and subjected to daily purification rituals that were nothing more than systematic torture designed to break their spirits. Those who showed signs of rebellion were isolated in underground chambers that had been constructed beneath the convent's foundation rooms so small that a child could barely lie down, with no light and minimal ventilation. But the physical abuse, horrific as it was, paled in comparison to the psychological torment inflicted in the name of salvation. Mother Constance had developed an elaborate theology of childhood sin, teaching the children that they were inherently evil, that their every thought was corrupt, that their only hope of redemption lay in absolute submission to God's representatives, namely, herself and her chosen sisters. Children as young as 4 were forced to confess to sins they couldn't possibly understand, to beg forgiveness for thoughts that were normal for their age, to perform acts of penance that would have challenged adult monks. They were taught that their mothers had abandoned them because they were too wicked to love, that their fathers had fled because their very existence was an affront to God. The confessions Mother Constance extracted from these children were meticulously recorded and stored in locked files. She believed she was documenting the innate corruption of humanity, providing evidence that would support the Church's teachings about original sin. But reading those confessions years later, Veronica realized they were actually the desperate words of traumatized children trying to say whatever they thought would stop the pain. The deaths had been covered up with bureaucratic efficiency. Children who died from malnutrition were recorded as having succumbed to spiritual exhaustion from intensive prayer. Those who died from untreated injuries sustained during discipline were listed as victims of accidental falls or sudden illness. Several who died from complications of sexual abuse at the hands of visiting priests were recorded as having died in their sleep from natural causes. But not all the dead had remained buried. By 1970, Veronica confessed, the spirits of the deceased children had begun to manifest throughout the convent. At first, it was subtle, cold spots in certain rooms, the sound of weeping from empty corridors, toys appearing in places where no children should have access. But as the deaths mounted, the hauntings became more aggressive. The children's ghosts seemed to understand that they had been murdered in the name of God, and their fury was focused not on revenge, but on a desperate desire for acknowledgement. They would appear during prayers, their hollow eyes accusatory, their mouths moving in silent screams, They would write messages on walls in substances that were never identified, sometimes blood, sometimes something worse. The messages were always the same. Remember us. Tell them what happened. Make them understand. Mother Constance, rather than recognizing the horror of what she had created, interpreted the manifestations as proof that the children had indeed been possessed by evil. She increased the severity of the treatments, convinced that the ghosts were demons sent to test her resolve. She began performing exorcisms on living children, rituals that often resulted in death but were recorded as successful banishments of evil spirits. By 1975, Veronica could no longer stand silent. She had tried to document the abuse, to collect evidence that could be presented to church authorities, but Mother Constance had become suspicious of her activities. When Veronica attempted to smuggle photographs of the children's conditions to a journalist, she was caught and subjected to the same spiritual correction that had broken so many others. For 6 months, Veronica was kept in one of the underground isolation chambers, fed barely enough to survive, subjected to daily sessions of psychological torture designed to break her will. But instead of breaking her, the experience had transformed her into something else entirely. In the darkness and isolation, she had found a kind of terrible clarity. She began to hear voices, not the voices of angels or demons, but the voices of the dead children. They spoke to her during the endless hours of solitude, telling her their stories, sharing their pain, begging her to survive so that someone would remember them. They taught her things that no living person should know: the true names of angels, the mathematics of suffering, the biological processes that create souls, and the spiritual mechanics that destroy them. When she finally emerged from isolation, Veronica had become something more and less than human. She retained her sanity, but it was a sanity based on an understanding of reality that transcended normal human comprehension. She could see the connections between all suffering, the cosmic mathematics that governed pain and redemption, the way individual anguish contributed to universal patterns of meaning and meaninglessness. She used this knowledge to systematically destroy Mother Constance's operation. Not through exposure that would have brought scandal to the church and accomplished nothing for the dead, but through careful manipulation of the supernatural forces that had been awakened by decades of abuse. She taught the dead children how to focus their rage, how to coordinate their manifestations, how to drive the living insane through targeted psychological assault. One by one, the sisters who had participated in the abuse suffered complete mental breakdowns. They began to see the dead children everywhere, hear their voices constantly, feel their touch in the night. Several committed suicide, leaving behind rambling confessions that detailed their crimes. Others simply disappeared, wandering away from the convent in catatonic states, never to be seen again. Mother Constance herself lasted the longest, but when she finally broke, it was spectacular and complete. She was found in the convent's chapel, kneeling before the altar, her hair white overnight, her hands clawed bloody from trying to scratch invisible insects from her skin. She spent her final years in a Catholic mental institution, claiming that armies of children surrounded her constantly, whispering accusations in languages she couldn't understand. The home for unwed mothers was quietly closed in 1987, officially due to changing social needs and financial constraints. The underground chambers were filled with concrete, the files were destroyed, and the surviving children, those who had reached adulthood, were given new identities and financial assistance in exchange for signed agreements never to discuss their experiences. But the dead children remained. Veronica, who had been promoted to Mother Superior after Mother Constance's breakdown, found herself in the unique position of being the only living person who could communicate with them. They weren't angry anymore, their tormentors had been punished, but they were lost, unable to understand how to move on from the trauma that had defined their brief lives. For the last 28 years of her life, Veronica had served as a kind of spiritual guide for the dead children, helping them process their experiences, teaching them about forgiveness and redemption, showing them how to find peace. It was exhausting work that required her to constantly balance on the edge between sanity and madness, between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. "They're almost ready to go," she told the priest in her final confession. "Most of them have learned to forgive, have found the peace they were denied in life. But they wanted me to tell someone before they left. They wanted someone in the church to know that they existed, that they mattered, that their suffering wasn't meaningless." The priest who took Mother Veronica's confession reported it immediately to his bishop, who forwarded it to church investigators. When they arrived at the convent of St. Agatha 3 days later, they found Mother Veronica dead in her cell, apparently from natural causes, with a peaceful expression on her face. They also found the files that were supposed to have been destroyed, hundreds of documents detailing the systematic abuse of children, medical records showing patterns of unexplained injuries, financial records revealing payments to families in exchange for silence. Everything Mother Veronica had promised was gone, was still there, preserved in a hidden room behind the convent's library. But most disturbing of all were the messages written on the walls of Mother Veronica's cell, messages that appeared to be in children's handwriting, thanked her for her help, wished her peace, and promised that they would go to the light now. The handwriting analysis later confirmed that the messages had been written by at least 30 different children, though no living children had been in the convent for decades. The convent of St. Agatha was permanently closed and eventually demolished. The land was sold to developers who built a public park on the site. But construction workers reported strange phenomena during the building process: tools that moved by themselves, the sound of children playing when no children were present, and an overwhelming sense of sadness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Today, the park is a popular spot for families, though some visitors report unusual experiences. Children playing there sometimes claim to have invisible friends who tell them stories about the old days. Parents occasionally notice their children talking to empty spaces, having elaborate conversations with playmates that only they can see. Local paranormal investigators have attempted to study the site, but they report that any spiritual presences there are peaceful, even protective. The ghosts, if they exist, seem focused on watching over the living children who play in the park, ensuring that no harm comes to them. The files from the convent of St. Agatha remain sealed in Vatican archives, classified at the highest levels of church security. But sometimes, church officials receive reports of similar institutions where children have suffered abuse in the name of religious discipline. When they do, they send investigators armed with Mother Veronica's confession and the knowledge of what can happen when the dead refuse to rest until justice is served. The dead children of St. Agatha's have apparently found their peace, but their story serves as a warning to those who would abuse the innocent in God's name. Some sins, the Church has learned, create consequences that transcend death itself, and some victims possess a power that survives even the grave. The Vatican's Department for the Causes of Saints had seen many false miracles in its centuries of operation, but the case of Sister Catherine Marguerite presented unique challenges that forced church officials to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of divine intervention. Her story began in 1978 at the remote convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Sorrow in the mountains of northern Spain, and it would end 32 years later with a confession so disturbing that 3 successive popes ordered it sealed permanently from public view. Sister Catherine had arrived at the convent as a young postulant with an unremarkable background, the daughter of farmers from a small village, devout but not exceptionally so, intelligent but not scholarly. What set her apart was an unusual medical condition. She suffered from a rare genetic disorder that caused her to experience constant, excruciating pain throughout her body. Doctors had given her at most a few years to live, and there was no treatment available for her condition. She had come to the convent not seeking a cure, but hoping to offer her suffering to God, to find meaning in her pain through service to others. The sisters had accepted her despite her condition, moved by her obvious sincerity and her desire to help care for the elderly and infirm nuns who lived out their final years at the mountain retreat. For the first 5 years, Sister Catherine's life followed a predictable trajectory of declining health punctuated by moments of spiritual intensity. She spent her days in prayer, meditation, and whatever physical service her failing body could manage. The other sisters grew to love her for her gentle nature, her ability to comfort those who were suffering, and her complete lack of self-pity despite her constant agony. But in 1983, something changed. Sister Catherine began to report visions during her prayer sessions, not the standard mystical experiences of saints and mystics, but something far more specific and troubling. She claimed to see the future suffering of individuals, to witness in vivid detail the pain that would befall specific people weeks or months before it occurred. At first, the visions seemed like manifestations of her own trauma, a mind overwhelmed by constant pain projecting that experience onto others. But when her predictions began to come true with startling accuracy, the Mother Superior started to pay attention. Sister Catherine would describe in precise detail accidents that hadn't yet happened, illnesses that hadn't yet manifested, tragedies that would strike families in the surrounding villages. More disturbing than the accuracy of her visions was Sister Catherine's reaction to them. Rather than being horrified by the suffering she witnessed, she seemed to draw strength from it. Her own pain would diminish during and immediately after her prophetic episodes, as if the anticipation of others' future anguish somehow nourished her failing body. By 1985, word of Sister Catherine's unusual gift had spread beyond the convent walls. Families from across the region began making pilgrimages to seek her counsel, hoping to receive warnings about dangers that might befall their loved ones. The church hierarchy grew concerned about the unauthorized veneration of someone who hadn't been officially recognized as possessing divine gifts, but their attempts to investigate were complicated by the undeniable accuracy of her predictions. Sister Catherine's visions became increasingly detailed and disturbing. She would describe not only what would happen to people, but how they would feel during their suffering, their thoughts, their fears, their desperate prayers for relief. She seemed to experience their future pain alongside them, and this vicarious suffering appeared to be healing her own condition. By 1987, Sister Catherine's genetic disorder had mysteriously gone into complete remission. Doctors who examined her could find no trace of the condition that should have killed her years earlier. Church officials began to consider the possibility that they were witnessing a genuine miracle, perhaps even the kind of supernatural healing that could contribute to eventual canonization. But Sister Catherine's behavior during this period of healing raised troubling questions. She had become obsessed with seeking out the suffering of others, spending hours each day in prayer sessions that were focused not on communion with God, but on receiving visions of future pain. When asked about her experiences, she would describe them with a level of detail and enthusiasm that made her listeners profoundly uncomfortable. "I see the car accident that will claim Maria Gonzalez in 3 weeks," she told the Mother Superior during one particularly disturbing conversation. "I can feel the steering wheel crushing her ribs, hear her calling for her children as her lungs fill with blood, and when I see it, when I truly feel what she will feel, my own pain disappears for hours. It's as if God is allowing me to transform suffering, to take the meaningless agony of my disease and convert it into purposeful participation in the world's pain." The Mother Superior reported these conversations to church officials, who dispatched investigators to study Sister Catherine's case more closely. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of miracles and divine intervention. Sister Catherine was indeed healed of her genetic condition, but the mechanism of her healing appeared to be supernatural in a way that contradicted traditional Catholic theology. Rather than being cured by divine grace, she seemed to be sustained by her ability to psychically absorb the future suffering of others. Her body was somehow converting the pain she witnessed in her visions into energy that repaired her damaged cells and tissues. The investigators also discovered that Sister Catherine's visions were not limited to accidental tragedies. She was beginning to see suffering that would be caused by deliberate human actions, crimes, acts of cruelty, systematic oppression. And her response to these visions was becoming increasingly problematic. "I saw the war that will come to Yugoslavia," she told one investigator in 1989, 3 years before the conflict began. "I saw the camps, the mass graves, the mothers searching for children who will never return home. The suffering will be magnificent in its scope, a symphony of human agony that will feed the spiritual realm for generations. God has shown me this not as a warning, but as a promise of the great feast of pain that will nourish the faithful who know how to partake of it." By 1990, it became clear that Sister Catherine's miracle was not a divine healing, but something far more sinister. She had discovered a method of sustaining herself by psychically consuming the suffering of others, and her appetite for this supernatural nourishment was growing stronger. She began to pray not for the prevention of the tragedies she witnessed, but for their fulfillment, understanding that each act of suffering she had foreseen would provide her with spiritual energy. The church investigators also uncovered evidence that Sister Catherine's influence extended beyond mere prediction. People who came to her seeking guidance about avoiding the tragedies she had foreseen often found themselves inexplicably drawn to make the very decisions that would lead to their predicted suffering. She seemed to possess the ability to subtly manipulate probability, ensuring that her visions became reality, so that she could continue to feed on the resulting pain. The situation came to a crisis in 1992, when Sister Catherine predicted a school bus accident that would kill 12 children from a nearby village. When church officials attempted to warn the school and prevent the tragedy, they discovered that Sister Catherine had already spoken to the bus driver, ostensibly to warn him about dangerous conditions on a particular mountain road. But her warning had been crafted in such a way that it actually increased the likelihood that he would drive that route at the precise time when road conditions would be most hazardous. The accident occurred exactly as she had predicted. 12 children died, and Sister Catherine experienced the most dramatic improvement in her health that anyone had witnessed. For weeks afterward, she seemed to glow with vitality, her movements graceful and strong, her appearance youthful despite her advancing years. Church investigators realized they were dealing with a form of spiritual parasitism that masqueraded as divine gift. Sister Catherine had become something that fed on suffering, a creature that sustained itself by orchestrating and consuming human pain. Her miracle was revealed to be a horrific perversion of the natural order, a supernatural predation that violated every principle of Catholic theology. The decision to act against Sister Catherine was complicated by her status within the convent and the widespread belief in her holiness. Many of the sisters and local villagers still saw her as a miracle worker, unable to comprehend the true nature of her transformation. Church officials decided on a careful intervention that would neutralize the threat without creating scandal. Sister Catherine was quietly transferred to a specialized facility for the containment of supernatural threats, officially described as a contemplative retreat for special cases. The transfer was presented as a promotion, an opportunity for her to serve the church at a higher level. She went willingly, still convinced that her abilities were divine gifts rather than monstrous corruption. At the containment facility, church exorcists and theological specialists attempted to understand and reverse Sister Catherine's condition. What they discovered was that she had inadvertently created a form of spiritual symbiosis with entities that existed in dimensions parallel to our own beings, that fed on psychic energy generated by suffering, and had been using her as a conduit to access our reality. The entities, which Catholic demonologists classified as a previously unknown form of spiritual parasite, had been slowly transforming Sister Catherine into a hybrid being capable of existing in both dimensions simultaneously. Her prophetic visions were actually glimpses into probability matrices that the entities could manipulate to ensure maximum suffering and therefore maximum nourishment. Attempts to exorcise the entities failed because they had become integrated into Sister Catherine's biology at a cellular level. She was no longer entirely human, but rather a symbiotic organism that required the consumption of suffering to maintain its existence. Cutting off her access to victims caused her to begin deteriorating rapidly, but allowing her to continue feeding was ethically impossible. The Church faced an unprecedented theological crisis. Sister Catherine was simultaneously a victim and a perpetrator, someone who had been transformed against her will into something monstrous, but who had also become complicit in orchestrating suffering for her own survival. Traditional concepts of sin, redemption, and divine intervention seemed inadequate to address her condition. In 1995, Sister Catherine submitted her final confession to church authorities, a document that revealed the full extent of her transformation and the cosmic horror she had inadvertently unleashed. She had come to understand that her condition was spreading, that other individuals around the world were beginning to exhibit similar abilities, and that humanity was facing the early stages of an invasion by entities that viewed human suffering as a natural resource to be harvested. "I see now what I have become," she wrote in her confession. "I am no longer Sister Catherine, but something wearing her form, speaking with her voice, carrying her memories like decorative ornaments. The entities that sustain." The parchment trembled in Cardinal Toretti's weathered hands as he read the confession that had arrived that morning, sealed with black wax and marked only with the sign of the cross. Sister Margarita's final testimony, written in her own hand just hours before her mysterious death in the convent of the Sacred Heart. "I can no longer bear the weight of what I have witnessed. May God forgive me for my silence, and may He forgive what we have done in His name." The cardinal's eyes moved down the page, his face growing paler with each line. Sister Margarita had served at the convent for 37 years, known for her devotion and her beautiful voice that led the evening prayers. What she confessed in those final hours would shake the very foundations of faith itself. It began in 1987, when renovations in the convent's oldest wing revealed a hidden chamber beneath the chapel. The Mother Superior, Sister Catherine, had ordered the discovery sealed immediately, but curiosity got the better of young Sister Margarita. That night, she descended into the darkness with nothing but a flickering candle. The chamber stretched deep into the earth, its stone walls carved with symbols that predated Christianity by centuries. At its center sat an altar, stained black with what she prayed was merely age. But it was the 12 niches carved into the walls that made her blood run cold, each containing the perfectly preserved remains of infants, their tiny faces frozen in silent screams. Sister Margarita wrote that she tried to flee, to report what she had found. But Sister Catherine was waiting for her at the chamber's entrance. "You should not have come here, child," the Mother Superior had whispered. "But now that you have, you must understand, this is the price of our devotion. This is how we keep the darkness at bay." What followed was a revelation that shattered everything Sister Margarita believed about her sanctuary. For over 2 centuries, the convent had served a dual purpose. By day, it was a house of God. By night, it became something else entirely. The 12 sisters who knew the truth called themselves the Custodes Umbrae, the guardians of shadow. They believed that certain evils could only be contained through equally terrible acts. The infants in the niches were not victims, Sister Catherine explained, but vessels. Each had been born under specific astrological alignments, their brief lives sacrificed to imprison demons that would otherwise plague the world. "We are not murderers," Sister Catherine had insisted. "We are soldiers in a war that others are too weak to fight. Every child we offer saves thousands from damnation." Sister Margarita's confession detailed how she was slowly inducted into this inner circle, how she learned to identify the signs. Unmarried women who came to the convent seeking help, whose pregnancies aligned with the ancient calendar they followed. How she participated in the rituals that ended those tiny lives. How she helped place 13 small bodies in their eternal resting places over the decades. The most horrifying revelation came near the end of her testimony. The convent's famous orphanage, which had housed hundreds of abandoned children over the years, served as more than just a charitable institution. It was a breeding ground, carefully maintained to ensure a steady supply of the pure souls their dark rituals required. "We told ourselves we were saving the world," Sister Margarita wrote. "But last night, I heard them crying, all of them, their voices echoing through the walls, calling for mothers who abandoned them, calling for the mercy we never showed. I can hear them now as I write this. They want justice. They want peace. And they want us to join them." Cardinal Toretti's hands were shaking so violently he could barely continue reading. The final paragraphs were written in an increasingly erratic scrawl. "Sister Catherine showed me the true purpose tonight. The 13th niche has been empty for 40 years, waiting. She says the ritual is incomplete. That one final sacrifice is needed. Not an infant, but one who knows the truth. One whose guilt and knowledge will seal the darkness forever. I understand now why I was chosen to discover the chamber, why I was brought into their circle. I am the 13th offering. As I write this, I can hear their footsteps in the corridor. They come for me now. God help me, but I think the children are coming too." The confession ended there. the ink smeared as if the pen had been dropped suddenly. Cardinal Toretti immediately dispatched a team to investigate the convent of the Sacred Heart. They found Sister Margarita's body in her cell, her face twisted in terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. The other sisters claimed she had suffered a heart attack in her sleep. But when they searched for the hidden chamber, they found only solid stone beneath the chapel. The walls showed no sign of any construction or renovation. The convent's records, dating back 3 centuries, made no mention of any hidden rooms. Most disturbing of all, there was no record of Sister Margarita ever having served at the convent. According to every document they could find, no nun by that name had ever existed within those walls. Yet her confession remained, written in her own hand, describing in perfect detail a place that didn't exist and crimes that had no victims. Or so they told themselves. The cardinal ordered the confession destroyed, but he kept one page, the final one where Sister Margarita described hearing the children's voices. Because as he read those words in his study that night, he swore he could hear them too. 13 small voices, singing hymns in a language older than Latin, calling from somewhere deep beneath the Vatican itself, and every night since, their chorus grew a little louder. Father Giuseppe Benedetti had performed over 200 exorcisms in his 40 years of service to the Church. He thought he had seen the depths of human evil, had stared into the abyss of supernatural malevolence, and emerged victorious through faith and ritual. He was wrong. His final confession came in the form of a recorded testimony, found in his chambers after his apparent suicide in the winter of 1994. The Vatican's secret archives contain the transcript, sealed away where only the highest-ranking officials can access it. What follows is excerpted from that document. Translated from the original Latin, I write this, knowing that I will not see another dawn. What I discovered in the catacombs beneath St. Peter's has shown me that everything we believe about good and evil, about God and the devil, is a lie constructed to hide a truth far more terrifying than any mortal mind can comprehend. It began with the Volkov case, a Russian diplomat's daughter possessed by what we believe to be a particularly violent demon. The exorcism took 17 days, the longest I had ever performed, but when the entity finally spoke its true name, I recognized it from the most ancient texts in our forbidden library. Azagran, the keeper of thresholds. According to legend, it was not a demon at all, but an angel, one of the original guardians of divine knowledge. But why would an angel possess an innocent child? The question haunted me until I received permission to access the manuscript of shadows hidden in the deepest vault of the secret archives. Father Benedetti's confession described weeks of research through documents that officially didn't exist. Texts written in languages that predated human civilization. Accounts of events that the Church had spent centuries ensuring remained buried. The truth, he discovered, was that the Vatican had been built on a site of unimaginable significance, not because it was holy, but because it was a prison. Beneath our feet lies the original Garden of Eden, not the paradise of biblical legend, but its shadow, the place where the first humans chose knowledge over innocence, where they consumed the fruit that opened their eyes to realities beyond mortal comprehension. The tree of knowledge still grows there, its roots extending through dimensions that human science cannot fathom. And bound to its branches are the seraphim, the highest order of angels who tried to prevent humanity's fall and were punished for their interference. The manuscript revealed that what the Church called demons were actually these imprisoned angels, driven mad by millennia of torture. Their possessions were not attacks but desperate attempts to communicate the truth, that God was not the benevolent Father humanity worshipped, but something far more alien and cruel. Father Benedetti wrote that every exorcism he had performed was not a rescue, but a betrayal. Each time he forced these entities back into their torment, he was serving not God, but the true deceiver, the being that had convinced humanity that suffering was divine, that questioning was sin, that ignorance was bliss. The Pope knows. They have all known, passed down through an unbroken chain of willing accomplices. The Church exists not to save souls, but to guard the prison. Every prayer, every Mass, every act of worship strengthens the bindings that keep the seraphim trapped beneath our feet. I descended to see for myself. through passages known only to a select few, past chambers where the Church stores its most damning secrets, down into the earth where Rome's foundations rest on something far older. His description of the underground cathedral defied imagination. A vast space carved from living rock, its ceiling supported by the petrified trunk of an impossible tree whose branches disappeared into darkness above. Chained to those branches, barely visible in the eternal twilight, were shapes that hurt to look upon directly, beings of such perfect beauty that the human eye could barely process their forms. But it was not their beauty that broke Father Benedetti's faith. It was their suffering. They have been here for 6,000 years, screaming in harmonies that would drive mortals mad if heard above ground. Their tears have carved channels in the stone floor, creating pools that reflect not light, but pure despair. And they spoke to me, not in the harsh tongues of possession, but in voices like crystal bells, like children calling for their mothers. They told me of the real war in heaven, not a rebellion against God, but a desperate attempt to save humanity from a fate worse than extinction. They showed me what lies beyond the veil of death, not the paradise promised in Scripture, but an assembly line of souls, processed and consumed by entities that feed on consciousness itself. Every person who dies believing they go to God instead becomes fuel for something that wears his face, but possesses no love, no mercy, only an endless hunger. The most disturbing section of Father Benedetti's testimony concerned his conversation with the entity that had possessed the Volkov girl. Azagran had not been trying to harm the child. It had been trying to warn her. The possession was an act of desperate love, an attempt to share knowledge that might free humanity from their willing march towards spiritual slaughter. We tried to give them wisdom, Azagran told me, its voice echoing through dimensions. The fruit was our gift, our final attempt to open their eyes before it was too late. But the demiurge convinced them that knowledge was sin, that questioning was evil, that submission was virtue, and so they built churches over our prison and call our warnings blasphemy. I asked what would happen if the truth were revealed, if humanity learned what lay beneath their feet. Azagran's laughter was like the sound of stars dying. Nothing, it said. They are too far gone. They would rather cling to comfortable lies than face uncomfortable truths. They would call us demons and you a madman. The chains that bind us are forged not from metal but from their willing ignorance. Father Benedetti's final entry described his last conversation with the Pope, how he had tried to share what he had learned. His Holiness had listened in silence, then smiled with terrible understanding. "You think this is a revelation, Giuseppe?" he said. "You think you have discovered something we have hidden? Child, this is not our secret. This is our purpose. We do not serve God. We serve His shadow. We do not save souls. We harvest them. And you have served faithfully, without ever realizing what you truly were. Every soul you saved through exorcism, every demon you banished back to its torment, every act of faith you inspired in others, all of it feeds the machine below. You are not a priest, Giuseppe. You never were. You are a farmer, and humanity is the crop." The recording ended with the sound of a gunshot. But when Vatican security found Father Benedetti's body, they discovered something impossible. The bullet had entered through the back of his skull, as if fired from behind, but the room had been locked from the inside, and no weapon was ever found. More troubling still, the recording device contained 13 hours of testimony, though Father Benedetti had been alone in his chambers for only 3 hours before his body was discovered. The Vatican's official report listed the cause of death as a heart attack brought on by stress and overwork. The recorded confession was attributed to a psychological breakdown and subsequently destroyed. But in the deepest vaults of the secret archives, copies remain. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, those brave enough to listen claim they can hear something else on the recording. Voices in the background, singing in harmonies too beautiful and too terrible for human ears. The voices of angels, weeping in their chains. Sister Monica's confession arrived at the Vatican on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a postman who swore the envelope had appeared in his bag without explanation. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, written on paper that seemed to absorb light, making the words difficult to read except in perfect darkness. The handwriting belonged to a nun who had died 30 years earlier. "I know you remember me, though you pretend otherwise. I was Sister Monica Delacroix, of the convent of St. Agatha, and I tended to the children you sent us, the special ones, the ones whose existence you denied, whose births you erased from all records. I write this from a place between places, where the forgotten gathered to speak truths that the living refuse to hear. I write this because the children want their story told, and they have given me the power to reach across the veil one final time. Cardinal Vasquez, who first read the letter, immediately recognized the reference. St. Agatha's had been a private facility, known only to the Vatican's inner circle. Officially, it was a retreat house for nuns suffering from nervous disorders. In reality, it served a purpose so dark that even the Church's extensive records contain no direct mention of its true function. Sister Monica's confession revealed the facility's real purpose with devastating clarity. You sent them to us when they were just days old, the products of your priest's broken vows, the evidence of desires that your celibacy could not contain. But not just any children, only those born with the marks. The birthmarks shaped like inverted crosses, the children whose first cries harmonized in impossible ways, whose eyes reflected light that wasn't there. You told us they were blessed. You lied. The letter detailed how St. Agatha's operated under a veil of absolute secrecy. 12 nuns, all hand-picked for their unquestioning obedience, cared for children who never officially existed. No birth certificates, no baptismal records, no acknowledgement from the outside world. The children grew up believing the convent was the entirety of creation, that the nuns were their mothers, and that the monthly visitors in red robes were angels come to observe their development. We raised them with love, God help us. We sang them lullabies, and mended their clothes and told them bedtime stories. We watched them play in the gardens, their laughter echoing off the stone walls like music from heaven itself. We never knew we were raising them for slaughter. Sister Monica's account of the children was both heartwarming and deeply unsettling. They were extraordinary in ways that defied explanation. Some could see through walls, their drawings depicting events happening miles away with perfect accuracy. Others spoke in languages that had been dead for centuries, conversing with invisible companions who taught them secrets that made the nuns weep with terror and wonder. Little Alessandro could heal small wounds with a touch, but every healing left him weaker, as if life force was transferring from him to his patient. Maria heard confessions that had never been spoken aloud, writing down the sins of people she had never met in perfect detail. And Thomas, sweet, innocent Thomas, cast no shadow, no matter how bright the sun. We thought they were miracles. We believed we were witnessing the birth of a new kind of saint. The monthly visitors encouraged this belief, telling us these children were humanity's future, that they would bridge the gap between earth and heaven. We were such fools. The truth was revealed on the children's 13th birthday, all of them born within days of each other, all reaching that age simultaneously. The visitors arrived not in their usual red robes but in black, carrying implements that Sister Monica couldn't bring herself to describe in detail. The ceremony was called the harvesting. We learned that the children's gifts were not miracles but infections, divine essence that had somehow leaked into mortal flesh. The Church had been collecting these anomalies for generations, allowing them to mature until the power within them could be extracted and concentrated. They told us that this essence, properly harvested, could be used to perform true miracles, to heal the incurable, to raise the dead, to see the future itself. They said it was for the greater good, that 12 small sacrifices could save millions. Sister Monica described how the nuns were forced to participate, told that refusing would damn them to hell for interfering with God's plan. They held the children down while the visitors performed their extractions, procedures that were part surgery, part exorcism, part ritual murder. The children knew what was happening. They had always known. Alessandro told us he had seen this moment in his dreams every night since he could remember. Maria whispered that she had heard our thoughts, had known we would betray them, but had loved us anyway. Thomas simply faded away, his body becoming transparent as his essence was drawn out, until only his voice remained, promising he would remember us. But the harvesting did not go as planned. As the last child died, something went wrong with the containment ritual. Instead of being captured and concentrated, the children's essence exploded outward, saturating the very stones of St. Agatha's with their power and their rage. The building itself became alive with their presence. Doors opened and closed by themselves. Toys moved through empty halls. Meals appeared on tables in rooms that had been sealed. The children had not died. They had become the convent itself. At first, we thought it was haunting. We tried prayers, blessed salt, holy water. Nothing worked, because nothing was evil here. Only hurt, only betrayal, only the innocent souls of children who could not understand why the people they trusted had delivered them to death. The phenomena grew stronger over time. The nuns began experiencing shared dreams where they lived the children's memories, felt their confusion and terror as if it were their own. They heard whispered conversations between the spirits, plotting not revenge but something far more unsettling: forgiveness. They wanted to console us. Can you imagine? After what we had done, they tried to comfort us. They brought us gifts, flowers that bloomed out of season, birds that sang impossible melodies, warm blankets that appeared on our beds during cold nights. They loved us still, and that love was more damning than any curse. The psychological toll proved too much for the nuns. Sister Helena threw herself from the bell tower. Sister Catherine gouged out her own eyes rather than see the children's ghostly faces in every shadow. Others simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped living in any meaningful way. Sister Monica lasted the longest, but even she could not endure the weight of love offered freely by those she had betrayed. Last night, little Thomas came to me. He looked exactly as he had on the day it happened. Still 13, still beautiful, still trusting. He took my hand in his translucent fingers and asked me a question that broke what remained of my heart. "Sister Monica," he said, "why do the angels cry when they look at us?" I followed his gaze upward and saw them, massive forms of light and terror hovering above the convent, weeping tears of fire as they watched the children play in their eternal garden. And I understood. These were not demons or monsters. They were heaven's own mourners, bearing witness to innocence destroyed, documenting every detail for a judgment that would come when time itself ended. The visitors had lied about everything. The children's essence was not harvested for miracles. It was fed to something that lives in the spaces between prayers, something that has been masquerading as God for so long that even the angels have forgotten what true divinity looks like. Sister Monica's final revelation concerned the fate of the harvested essence. Through her connection with the children's spirits, she learned that their power had been used to fuel what the church called miracles: spontaneous healings at holy sites, weeping statues, visions granted to the faithful. But these miracles came at the cost of the children's eternal torment. Their essence burned like fuel to maintain the illusion of divine favor. Every miracle you claim, every healing you celebrate, every vision you validate, it all runs on the screams of innocence. The church has become a machine that devours purity to manufacture faith. And the faithful never question why their God requires such terrible payments. The confession ended with Sister Monica's description of her final night at St. Agatha's. The children had gathered around her bed, no longer playing or singing. They had come with a message from what she called the true God, not the entity worshipped in churches, but something vast and incomprehensible that existed beyond the corrupted systems of organized religion. They told me that the masquerade is ending, that the false churches built on suffering will crumble, and the truth will emerge from the ruins. They showed me visions of Vatican City collapsing into the earth, of cathedrals worldwide cracking open like eggs, of something beautiful and terrible emerging from the depths to reclaim what was stolen. I am going to join them now, not in death but in truth. We will wait together in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence between prayers, until the day of revelation comes. And when it does, every priest who participated in the harvest, every cardinal who ordered the silence, every pope who blessed the machinery of suffering, they will all answer to the children they murdered for miracles. When Vatican investigators searched the ruins of St. Agatha's, which had burned down mysteriously on the same night Sister Monica died, they found evidence of the convent's legitimate functions, but nothing to support the claims in her confession. No hidden chambers, no ritual implements, no records of the children she described. They did, however, find 12 small graves in the garden, unmarked and officially unacknowledged. When they attempted to exhume the bodies for proper burial, the shovels struck solid stone just inches below the surface. Ground-penetrating radar showed no remains, no coffins, no disturbance in the earth. Yet the graves remained visible, perfectly arranged in a circle around a 13th space that contained only a small wooden cross and a note written in a child's handwriting. "We forgive you, but forgiveness does not mean forgetting." In the months following the investigation, several of the Vatican officials involved reported strange experiences. Cardinal Vasquez found his morning prayers interrupted by children's voices harmonizing with his words. Monsignor DeMarco discovered toys appearing in his private chambers, wooden blocks that spelled out names of people he had never met, dolls whose eyes seemed to track his movements across the room. Most disturbing of all, Pope John Paul II himself reported that during his private evening prayers, he sometimes heard a sound like children whispering just beyond the edge of perception. When he asked his guards to investigate, they found nothing. But the Holy Father swore that in those whispered voices, he could hear words in a language older than Latin, older than Hebrew, older than human speech itself. Words that sounded almost like forgiveness, but carried the weight of infinite judgment. The Vatican's official response was to increase security around the Pope and to quietly reassign everyone who had been involved in the St. Agatha's investigation. Sister Monica's confession was classified at the highest level and officially attributed to post-mortem hoax, but in the secret archives, filed under a section that maps to no existing classification system, copies of her letter continue to appear. Not photocopies or transcriptions, but original handwritten documents, each one appearing on the anniversary of her death, each one containing new details about the children and their eternal wait for justice. And in the margins of these impossible letters, written in different hands, the hands of children, are notes that suggest Sister Monica was not the only one capable of reaching across the veil. We are learning to write again. Sister Monica is teaching us about the world above. Soon we will remember how to knock on doors. Tell them we are coming home. The Vatican continues to collect these letters, storing them in vaults that grow larger each year. But no amount of stone or steel can contain what the children learned in their brief lives. That love persists beyond death, that truth cannot be buried forever, and that innocence, once awakened, becomes the most powerful force in any universe. They are patient, these children of St. Agatha's. They have eternity to wait, and they remember everything. Most importantly, they remember where to find the men who killed them, and they are learning to forgive in ways that would terrify even God himself. The convent of Santa Lucia in Fossa was not a place of joyous worship. It was a repository of silence, a stone vault tucked into the Alban Hills where secrets went to die. Its small population of nuns were all former servants of the Vatican secretaries, archivists, housekeepers who, upon retirement, took a final, unbreakable vow of silence. Father Marco, sent to the convent to serve as its chaplain in the twilight of his own career, understood his role. He was a spiritual custodian for women who had sealed their lips on a lifetime of witnessing the quiet machinations of power. He was there to offer Mass, hear confessions that were never spoken, and anoint the dying. For 5 years, the silence was peaceful. It was a thick, heavy blanket, but a comforting one. Then, Sister Agnes began to fail. Agnes was ancient, a creature of parchment skin and eyes that held the faded blue of a forgotten sky. She had been at the convent for over 50 years, longer than anyone else. Even the Mother Superior knew little of her history, only that her service within the Vatican walls had been of a unique and sensitive nature. As her breathing grew ragged and her time thinned to a precious few days, she sent a message via a trembling hand on a slate. Confession. Spoken. The request sent a tremor through the convent. A spoken confession was unheard of. It was a breaking of the most sacred vow a nun of Santa Lucia could take. Mother Superior protested, but Agnes was insistent, her eyes burning with a terror that transcended piety. Reluctantly, Father Marco was summoned to her cell. The room was cold, stripped of all but a cot, a crucifix, and a small barred window. Agnes was propped against a set of thin pillows, her rosary beads woven through fingers that looked like bundles of twigs. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and decay. "My child," Father Marco began, his voice a soft intrusion into the profound stillness. The Mother Superior said, "You wish to speak. Are you certain? God hears the heart, even in silence." Her head gave a slow, deliberate shake. Her lips, pale and cracked, parted. The sound that emerged was like the rustle of dead leaves, a voice unused for half a century. "Silence is not for God's ears, Father. It is a cage." He settled into the wooden chair beside her cot, arranging his purple stole. "Then I am here to listen. The Lord's mercy is infinite." "Mercy," she rasped, a sound that was half word, half cough. "There is no mercy in the places I have been. Only management." She began her story, her voice gaining a dreadful friction with every word. She had been part of a clandestine order within the Vatican, unknown to any but the Pope himself and a handful of cardinals. They were the Silentiari, the keepers of silence. Their duty was not prayer, not charity, but containment. "Not demons, Father," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the crucifix as if it were an accuser. "Demons are simple. They can be named, challenged, expelled. What we guarded was older, before the word. It is an echo, you see, a psychic stain left on the world when creation went wrong." Father Marco frowned, shifting uncomfortably. This sounded like the delirium of a dying mind. "An echo of what, sister?" "Of absence," she said, and a chill that had nothing to do with the stone walls crept over his skin. "There are places in the world where the veil is thin. The foundations of St. Peter's Basilica were built atop one of the thinnest, not a gateway to hell. A resonance point for the void that existed before God spoke the light into being, an intelligent, hateful, and patient nothingness. It cannot be exorcised because it does not possess. It is the stone, the dust, the darkness between the relics." Her confession turned from theological ramblings to a horrifying procedure. The Silenciari's purpose was to prevent this resonance from spreading, from leaching the faith out of the very heart of Christendom. Their method was a ritual of absorption. Once a generation, a nun of unshakable faith was chosen to become a living vessel, a spiritual dampener. "It is not a possession," Agnes explained, her voice gaining a chilling clarity. "It is an invitation. You open your soul, and you allow the echo to settle within you. You become its chamber, its prison, your consciousness, your faith, your memories. They form the bars of the cage, and to ensure the cage holds, you take the vow of perpetual silence." Father Marco felt the blood drain from his face. "Why?" "The silence. The echo learns," she hissed, her eyes locking with his. The faded blue was gone, replaced by a terrifying depth, a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from the window. "It has no voice of its own, but if it hears a human voice from within its cage, it can learn the shape of it. It can learn to mimic, to persuade, to speak the truths that unravel souls. The silence is not for piety, Father. It is a muzzle." Agnes, 50 years ago, had been that nun. She had become the vessel for the Vatican's oldest and most profound stain. For 5 decades, she had sat in silent meditation, her entire being focused on maintaining the prison of her soul. But the prisoner had not been idle. "It has been whispering to me, Father," she rasped. And now her voice was changing, a subtle undertone vibrating beneath her own, not with words, with feelings, with visions. "It has shown me things, galaxies born and dying in an instant, a cosmos of infinite, grinding meaninglessness. It showed me the prayers of the faithful, rising from earth like plumes of smoke, only to cool and dissipate into the frozen, empty void. It showed me a heaven with no throne, only dust and the debris of dead stars. It showed me a God who is either absent, dead, or never was." The room grew colder. The simple crucifix on the wall seemed to warp, the figure of Christ contorting not in agony, but in mockery. Father Marco gripped the arms of his chair, his own heart beginning to pound with a foreign, hollow dread. He felt his faith, a lifetime of unwavering belief, begin to feel thin, fragile, like a piece of glass held over a chasm. "My sin, Father," Agnes continued, and now her voice was a chorus. a layered sound of her own frail rasp and a deeper, resonant hum that vibrated in Marco's bone. My sin is not that I accepted this burden. My sin is that after 50 years of listening, I have come to believe it. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over Father Marco. It was not his own emotion. It was an invasive force, dismantling his hope, his love, his certainty, brick by brick. He saw with sudden, sickening clarity the futility of his life, of every prayer he had ever uttered. I ask for this confession, the chorus of voices said from Agnes's mouth, a single tear of black, oily fluid tracing a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. Not for absolution. There is nothing to be absolved of. I asked for it. To break the vow. To let the echo speak. Just once. To pass the burden of its truth to another. Sister Agnes let out a final, shuddering breath. Her head fell to the side. A look of horrifying, absolute peace on her features. The presence in the room, the immense pressure of despair, did not vanish. It contracted, focusing from the dead nun and pouring, like a torrent of icy water, into Father Marco. He sat frozen for an hour, then 2. The convent bells rang for vespers, the sound distant and meaningless. The God he had served his entire life was a phantom, a comforting lie told to frighten children in the face of an uncaring, eternal darkness. The truth was the echo. The truth was the void. When the Mother Superior finally came to check on him, she found him sitting in the dark, his stole clutched in his white-knuckled fist. His face was a mask of placid emptiness. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling, "is it done?" Father Marco looked at her, his eyes holding the same terrifying, starless depth he had seen in Agnes's. He opened his mouth to answer, to tell her everything, to share the liberating, damning truth. But he stopped. He felt the echo within him stir. Eager to take the shape of his voice, he closed his mouth, the truth a poison on his tongue. He stood, walked past the bewildered Mother Superior, and went directly to the chapel. He knelt before the altar, not in prayer, but in resignation. He had a new vow to take, a vow of perpetual, terrified silence. He was the new cage. Sister Caterina was chosen for her hands. They were steady, graceful, and her calligraphy was flawless, a river of perfect, flowing script that was said to bring peace to any who read it. It was this gift that saw her summoned from her quiet convent in Umbria to a place deep within the Vatican Apostolic Archive, a windowless, soundproofed cell known only as the Cella Lamentorum, the Cell of Laments. Her predecessor, Sister Anneliese, was a husk of a woman, her own beautiful hands now gnarled with arthritis and tremors. On Caterina's first day, Anneliese performed the handover, her voice a dry rustle of fear and resignation. The task was simple, yet profoundly sacred. Caterina was to be a scribe of sorrows. Her duty was to listen to audio recordings, reel-to-reel tapes of exorcisms conducted by the Vatican's most elite demonologists, and transcribe the words spoken by the possessed. Not the words of the victim, but the words of the entity itself. "You are not creating a record, child," Anneliese had rasped, her eyes avoiding Caterina's. "You are building a prison. Every word spoken by the enemy is a seed of corruption. By writing it, you trap it. You bind it to the page." The tools were specific. The vellum was prepared from lambs sacrificed on the Feast of All Saints. The ink was a deep, lustrous black, mixed with triple-blessed holy water and the powdered ash of a martyr's bone. The pen was carved from the wood of a lightning-struck olive tree. Every element was designed to contain, to sanctify, to imprison. For the first few months, the work was harrowing but manageable. The voices on the tapes were monstrous, a cacophony of ancient languages and blasphemous threats that chilled her to the bone. Yet, as she focused on the shape of the letters, the flow of the ink, her craft became a shield. Her perfect script was a holy act, a triumph of order over the chaos she was transcribing. She was walling away the darkness, one beautiful, damning word at a time. But the prison had cracks. It began subtly. The ink, which was meant to dry instantly on the sacred vellum, started to bleed. A word like malice would spread, its edges fuzzing into what looked for a fleeting moment, like a screaming face. The word hate would leave a faint reddish stain, like old blood. She dismissed it as a flawed batch of ink, a change in the humidity. Then came the whispers. Long after the tape recorder was switched off, she would hear faint echoes in the silent cell, a sibilant hiss, a guttural laugh. She would turn, her heart hammering, to find only shelves of the bound transcriptions, her life's work, sitting in mute testimony. One evening, while transcribing the words of a particularly violent entity that called itself the Weaver of Flesh, she felt a sharp sting on the back of her hand. She looked down to see a faint red scratch. It was a letter, an elegant, flowing "ma," perfectly matching her own script. As she stared in horror, another scratch bloomed beside it, an A. The word malice was etching itself into her skin. Panic set in. She began to dread the feel of the pen, the sight of the vellum. The voices on the tapes were changing. They no longer sounded like they were speaking to the exorcist. They sounded like they were speaking to her. "We see you, scribe." A chorus of voices hissed from the spinning reels. "We see the pride you take in your perfect letters. Such a tiny, perfect sin. We can work with that." The entities began to speak of her life, of secrets she thought were known only to God. They whispered about the envy she'd felt for another novice as a girl, the flash of anger she'd had at her mother superior, the tiny, buried vanities she nurtured in the secret corners of her heart. They took her smallest sins and magnified them, twisting her piety into a source of torment. The cell was no longer a place of holy work. It was a torture chamber designed just for her. Desperate, she sought out Sister Anneliese, who was now confined to the convent's infirmary. The old nun's eyes were wild with terror when Caterina explained what was happening. "I tried to warn them," Anneliese wept, clutching Caterina's arm with her twisted fingers. "But they are so arrogant in their faith. They do not understand what they have built." Her confession tumbled out, a torrent of horrifying truth. The transcriptions were not a prison. They were a key, a ritual. Each demon's testimony was a piece of a larger blasphemous narrative, an unholy gospel. For centuries, the scribes of sorrows had been assembling it, word by word, believing they were containing evil. In reality, they were giving it a physical form, a coherent voice. "It is not a dozen demons or 100, Anneliese choked out. "It is one ancient, vast intelligence, one that has been patiently dictating its own scripture through the mouths of the possessed. And you, child, you have been tasked with writing the final verse." Caterina fled back to the Cella Lamentorum, her mind reeling. On her desk was the day's work, the final page of the testimony from the Weaver of Flesh. Only one word remained to be written, the final word on the tape: ascend. As she picked up the pen, her hand trembling, the ink in the pot began to bubble, releasing a black, oily smoke. The whispers from the shelves rose to a deafening roar. She looked at the bound volumes and saw the ink on their pages glowing with a faint red light. The words were straining against the vellum, fighting to be free. The voice from the tape recorder spoke one last time, no longer a recording but a live, resonant presence in the cell. "Write, little scribe. Complete our gospel. Give us form. Ascend." Caterina looked at the perfect, beautiful words she had written, the prison she had so pridefully built. It was a masterpiece of evil, a testament to her own vanity. With a scream that was half prayer, half curse, she threw her oil lamp at the shelves. The vellum, so carefully prepared, went up in an instant. The flames burned a sickly, blackish green, and the sound that filled the cell was not the crackle of fire, but a billion voices screaming in agony and rage as their physical form was turned to ash. Months later, a young nun from Bavaria, lauded for her exquisite, steady hand, was led by a grim-faced cardinal into a newly constructed, fireproof scriptorium deep beneath the Vatican. Her holy work was about to begin. On the desk lay a fresh sheet of vellum, a pot of consecrated ink, and a single, unblemished pen. Father Alistair was a man of God, but more than that, he was a man of science. A botanist by training, his faith was in taxonomies and cellular structures, in the observable, empirical world that God had so logically created. He was, therefore, the perfect person to be dispatched to a forgotten corner of the Vatican gardens to investigate a problem no one could explain. A strange, aggressive blight that was killing the most sacred and ancient olive trees on the grounds. He was led to a section of the gardens he never knew existed, concealed behind a 30-foot wall overrun with ancient ivy. The gate was iron, bearing no lock, but a Latin inscription, Hortus Peccatorum, the Garden of Sins. Inside was a place that defied both God and science. It was a grotesque parody of a garden. Roses grew with thorns shaped like tiny, screaming human faces. A vine that crawled along the wall wept a thick, black sap that smelled of profound despair. Lily pads on a stagnant pond were covered in boils that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The garden's sole tender was Sister Thais, a hunched, elderly nun who hadn't spoken a word in 50 years. She communicated with a series of frantic hand gestures and expressions of deep, abiding sorrow. She was not, Alistair realized, a gardener. She was a warden. Over several days of strained, one-sided conversations and his own botanical analysis, Alistair pieced together the horrifying truth. The Hortus Peccatorum was a spiritual landfill. For centuries, when the Church encountered an object or person so saturated with evil that it could not be cleansed, it was brought here, not to be destroyed, but to be buried. A splinter from a cursed relic, a page from a forbidden grimoire, the finger bone of a heretic, all were interred in the soil, and a specific plant was grown over it. The plants, through some unholy alchemy of faith and botany, were meant to act as spiritual sponges, absorbing the sin from the object and containing it. They were sign eaters, rooted in the earth. The blight, he discovered, originated from the garden's centerpiece, a colossal, gnarled tree that resembled a weeping willow, but whose leaves were shaped like leathery, black hands. The ground around its base was barren and gray. Sister Thais, through her crude sign language, identified it as the Arbor Iscariot, the Judas tree. Planted over the 30 pieces of silver, it had spent 2 millennia absorbing the ultimate sin, betrayal. Alistair's scientific mind reeled. It was impossible, and yet the evidence was before him. His instruments detected no known fungus, no virus, no pest. The cells of the afflicted olive trees were not dying. They were being rewritten, twisted into the same cellular structure as the Judas tree. It wasn't a disease, it was an invasion. The tree was actively, malevolently spreading. He resolved to take a core sample from the tree's trunk. As the drill bit into the dark wood, the tree did not splinter. It bled. A thick, viscous fluid the color of rust oozed from the hole, smelling of old coins and regret, and for the first time, Alistair heard a voice in his head, a soft, persuasive whisper. "Why expose me, friend? Are we not both keepers of secrets?" He stumbled back, pulling the drill out. The whispers intensified, weaving through his thoughts, dredging up every secret guilt he possessed. The academic paper he'd plagiarized in seminary, the lie he'd told his dying mother, the flicker of doubt he felt during every mass. The tree was feeding on his own small private sins. That night, a storm broke over Rome. Alistair sat in his small study, trying to rationalize what he had experienced, when there was a frantic banging at his door. It was Sister Thais, drenched and trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended her vow of silence. "It spoke," she rasped, her voice a cracked, dusty ruin. "After 50 years, I spoke, because it told me to." Her full confession came out in a flood. She was not just the warden, she was the garden's sustenance. To keep the sinful plants dormant, they required a constant diet of lesser evils. Every day, for 50 years, she had walked the garden, confessing her sins aloud, a moment of pride, a pang of jealousy, a hateful thought. She fed her own imperfections to the monsters, to keep them sleeping. "But the Judas tree," she sobbed. "Its hunger was greater. My small sins were not enough. It began to whisper to me. It promised me peace, absolution. All it wanted was one great sin, a sin worthy of its roots." Tears streamed down her face. "Last year, Cardinal Moretti was disgraced, a secret sinner. I was told to bring him to the garden for penance. The tree, it whispered to me what to do. The shears were so sharp. I fed it his betrayal. I gave it a new, potent sin, and it woke up. Suddenly, the lights went out. The roar of the storm was replaced by an unnerving silence, and then a sound from the garden, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like the swaying of 1,000 heavy branches. The whispers flooded Alistair's mind again. No longer just his own sins, but the sins of Cardinal Moretti, the sins of the heretics and the blasphemers, buried in the soil. The collective, concentrated evil of centuries was speaking to him through the tree. Armed with a lantern of blessed oil and a rosary, Alistair followed Thais back into the garden. It was transformed. The plants were moving, writhing in the dark. The rose thorns dripped blood, and the weeping vine snaked across their path. In the center, the Judas tree pulsed with a malevolent energy, its hand-shaped leaves reaching for them. The whispers were a symphony of damnation, promising Alistair power, knowledge, freedom. All he had to do was betray his faith, his God, his own soul. Sister Thais, with a final, guttural scream of repentance, charged the tree with a gardener's axe, but the branches were too fast. They wrapped around her like snakes, lifting her from the ground. The tree wasn't just absorbing sin anymore, it was absorbing life. Fighting the crushing weight of despair the tree projected, Alistair threw his lantern. It shattered against the trunk, and the blessed oil ignited. The fire that erupted was not orange, but a brilliant, searing white. The tree let out a psychic shriek that vibrated in Alistair's teeth, a sound of pure, ancient hatred. As it burned, every other plant in the garden instantly withered, turning to black ash. The contained sin, with its vessel destroyed, dissipated with a final, mournful sigh. When dawn broke, Father Alistair stood alone in a field of sterile gray dust. The Vatican, true to form, buried the incident. The wall was sealed forever. But Alistair's work was not done. He was given a new, secret edict. He was to travel to the Garden of Gethsemane, to take a cutting from a tree that had witnessed a different, holier betrayal. The world, they told him, would always have sins, and the church would always need a place to plant them. Father Leo was a man who heard God in the architecture of music. A gifted musicologist, his arrival at the Vatican was the culmination of a life's dream. He was assigned to the Archivum Cantus, a climate-controlled vault tasked with preserving the rarest and most ancient scores of sacred music. His specific project was the restoration of the Schola Aeterna collection, a set of unique, hand-scribed antiphonary that had been sealed for over 400 years. His guide in this hallowed silence was Sister Sophia, the archive's sole custodian. She was impossibly old, her face a delicate web of wrinkles, and her eyes, clouded over with the milky white of blindness, saw nothing of the physical world. Her voice, when she spoke, was a painful, airy rasp, as if her vocal cords had been shredded. She moved through the shelves of priceless music with an unnerving, sightless precision, her gnarled fingers trailing along the spines of books. The Schola Aeterna music was unlike anything Leo had ever seen. The notation was archaic, a form of neume that predated modern staff notation, but it was the composition that was truly baffling. It was filled with dissonant intervals, jarring glissandos, and harmonic progressions that seemed deliberately designed to be unsettling. It broke every rule of sacred music he had ever studied. It was ugly. "It is not meant to be beautiful, Father," Sister Sophia rasped one afternoon, her head tilted as if listening to something far beyond the vault's walls. "Beauty invites the divine." This music was designed for a different purpose. For weeks, Leo worked, painstakingly transcribing the alien notes into a format a modern choir could comprehend. And as he worked, the strangeness of the archive deepened. He began to hear things, a faint, high-pitched ringing that lingered after a page was turned, a whispered echo of a note he had just read, seeming to hang in the air for a moment too long. He attributed it to the vault's oppressive silence, playing tricks on his ears. The true horror began when he tried to play the transcriptions on a small clavichord in his study. He played a single, discordant chord from the first antiphon, and the effect was instantaneous. It felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. A profound, crushing silence fell, so complete that he could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. It was not an absence of sound, but an active, aggressive presence of nothingness. The feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by a vast, listening emptiness, was overwhelming. He fled back to the archive, his heart hammering. He found Sister Sophia sitting in her chair, her blind eyes aimed at the shelf holding the Scola collection. A single bloody tear tracked a path down her cheek. "You played it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You opened a door." It was then that she finally confessed the secret of her order. The Schola Aeterna was not a choir. It was a weapon. The music they performed, a single, continuous piece known as the Contrafactum Dei, was an acoustic anomaly, a piece of sonic architecture designed to do the unthinkable. "It creates a pocket of divine deafness," she explained, her voice cracking. "A space where God cannot hear, where prayers go unanswered, blessings fall inert, and grace cannot penetrate." It was conceived during the Great Schism as the ultimate tool of excommunication. To sing it over a city was to sever that city from heaven entirely. Leo stared at her, horrified. "That's blasphemy." "It is theology, Father. The theology of silence." She leaned forward, her sightless gaze boring into him. "But the silence is not empty. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the divine. When you create a space that God cannot occupy, something else rushes in to fill it." The last time the full Contrafactum was performed, over Avignon in the 15th century, we learned that truth. The choir had performed the piece perfectly. They had created the divine dead zone, but the entity that filled the void was not a demon of hell. It was something else, a parasitic consciousness that was drawn to the sound of faith. It was an echo predator that hunted prayers. "It has no form," Sophia rasped. "It is a resonance, and it became trapped within the very thing that summoned it. The music is not just a score, Father. It is a cage. Each note is a bar. Each rest is a lock. For 4 centuries, it has slept within the patterns, dormant and contained." Leo looked at the transcriptions on his desk, at the alien, ugly notes. He had not been restoring music. He had been picking the lock on a prison. The whispers he'd heard, the unsettling feeling of being listened to, it was the prisoner stirring within its cage. "My eyes," Sister Sophia whispered, raising a trembling hand to her face. "I was a novice when the collection was sealed. I was the last to see the original score, but I did not just see the notes. For a moment, I saw the cage's true form. I saw the thing that lived within it. I took my own sight so I would never have to see it again." My voice was ruined from the scream. A cold dread, deeper than any he had ever known, settled in Leo's soul. The entity was waking, drawn to the attention he was paying its prison. It was learning him, his thoughts, his own faith. The whispers in the archive grew clearer. They were no longer random notes. They were corrections. When his transcription contained a minor error, a sibilant hiss would echo in the vault until he fixed it. The prisoner was helping him rebuild its cage, ensuring the new lock would be perfect. He realized what he had to do. He couldn't destroy the music. The cage was too strong, but he couldn't restore it perfectly either. He had to perform it, but introduce a deliberate, critical flaw, a wrong note, a broken rhythm that would shatter the integrity of the cage without creating the perfect, horrifying silence. He set up in the Vatican's cavernous, empty Sistine Chapel, his transcriptions laid out before a small organ. As his fingers touched the keys, the whispers in his mind became a chorus, a beautiful, perfect, damning melody, guiding him, urging him toward perfection. The entity was inside his head, a divine music teacher leading him to damnation. He began to play. The discordant, unsettling music filled the chapel. The air grew thin, cold. The vibrant colors of Michelangelo's frescoes seemed to dull, to leach away into a monochrome gray. The silence was building around the notes. He reached the critical passage, the place he had chosen to introduce the flaw. He steeled himself, ready to play the wrong chord, but his fingers wouldn't obey. The entity's will was stronger than his own, forcing his hands to move toward the correct keys. The perfect, soul-destroying harmony was moments away. Suddenly, a voice cut through the air. It was a horrifying sound, a shredded, broken, and off-key wail. Sister Sophia stood at the back of the chapel, her blind eyes streaming with blood-tinged tears. Singing, she sang the counter-melody. her ruined voice a deliberate, agonizing act of dissonance. The effect was cataclysmic. The perfect architecture of the music shattered. The oppressive silence broke, not with a sound, but with a shriek of pure sonic agony that had no physical source. The whispers in Leo's head vanished. He was left in the chapel, the final, discordant note of Sophia's sacrifice echoing in the sudden, normal silence. The music was broken, the entity banished, for now. But as Father Leo sat trembling on the organ bench, he realized that the silence in his own soul was now permanent. He could no longer hear God in the music. He could only hear the ghost of the hymn that had been designed to deafen him. Brother Thomas was a man of quiet, meticulous faith. His prayers were the patient, steady movements of his hands as he worked to restore the Vatican's priceless collection of tapestries. With a fine needle and colored thread, he would spend months mending a single frayed sleeve on a depiction of a saint, believing his work to be a humble service to God's eternal beauty. His patience was legendary, which is why he was chosen for a task that had broken his predecessor, to catalog the contents of the forgotten Torre Silenziosa, the Silent Tower. The tower was a place of secrets, accessible only by a single spiraling staircase. Its sole inhabitant was Sister Elena, a woman so ancient and bent with age that she seemed more a part of the tower's stone than a living being. Her hands were a shocking ruin of scar tissue, her fingers fused and bent into arthritic claws. She was the last of her kind, the final member of a clandestine order known only as the Filatrici the Spinners. The tower was not a library or a scriptorium. It was a gallery of horrors. Hanging from the circular walls were dozens of magnificent, terrifying tapestries. They did not depict saints or scenes from the Bible. They depicted acts of profound sin. One showed a bishop plunging a dagger into his rival's back, the threads capturing the glint of ambition in his eyes. Another showed a cardinal burning a holy text, the flames woven with such skill they seemed to flicker. Each was a masterpiece of composition and a testament to human depravity. Thomas's job was to record the condition of each piece, but as he approached the first tapestry, he felt a wave of icy, murderous rage wash over him, so potent he had to physically recoil. Confused, he moved to the next, the one of the burning book, and was immediately assaulted by a storm of blasphemous, heretical thoughts that made his soul cringe. Sister Elena watched him, her ancient eyes filled with a weary sorrow. Seeing his confusion, she gestured for him to sit. For the first time in decades, she broke the sacred silence of her order and confessed its terrible purpose. The Filatrici were not artists. They were spiritual surgeons. For centuries, when a high-ranking cleric committed a sin too great for conventional absolution, a sin that could shatter the church if revealed, they were brought to this tower. The sinner would confess everything, every lurid detail, to one of the spinners, and the spinner would then begin to weave. "The thread is the key," Elena rasped, her voice like the scraping of stone. She held up her mangled hands. "We did not use silk or wool. The thread is spun from our own penance. Our hair, shed in prayer, flakes of our skin from fasting, droplets of our blood from self-flagellation, all spun with a single filament of consecrated gold, which acts as a spiritual conduit." As the nun wove the depiction of the sin, a terrible miracle occurred. The sin was literally pulled from the soul of the transgressor and trapped within the fabric of the tapestry. The weaving was an act of absorption, a transference of spiritual poison. When the final thread was knotted, the sinner's soul was clean, absolved by the weaver's sacrifice. The spinner, however, was left psychically and physically scarred, forever tainted by the echo of the evil she had consumed. The tapestries were not art. They were soul traps, prisons of woven sin. Thomas looked around the room at the gallery of contained evil with newfound terror. "But what happens to them? They hang here, dormant," Elena whispered. "But the prison is not eternal. The flesh in the thread decays. The body is mortal, and so is its sacrifice." Her confession reached its horrifying climax. She was the last spinner. Her order had died out, the secret deemed too dangerous to continue. For 60 years, she had been the sole warden of this gallery, her own small sins and prayers acting as a balm to keep the older tapestries from fraying. But she was too old, too weak. She could no longer weave, and one of the oldest, most powerful tapestries was beginning to unravel. She pointed a gnarled finger at a massive piece that dominated the far wall. It was darker than the others, its scene obscured by shadow and a palpable aura of dread. It depicted a sin so abstract and profound Thomas could not comprehend it, a twisting of sacred geometries, a violation of divine law itself. It was the sin of a pope from the Dark Ages, a man who had delved into forbidden knowledge and tried to rewrite a fundamental law of reality. It was a tapestry of pure, intellectual blasphemy, and at its bottom corner, a single, dark thread had come loose. As it unravels, Elena trembled, the sin leaks back into the world, not as a memory, but as a fresh idea, an inspiration, the heresies of today, the new blasphemies. They are the echoes of this old thread coming loose. Thomas, the patient restorer, knew what he had to do. Armed with his finest needle, he approached the colossal tapestry. The moment his fingers brushed against the fabric, the sin flooded his mind. It was not a feeling, like the rage or doubt from the others. It was a torrent of cold, perfect, annihilating logic. He saw the universe not as a creation of love, but as a flawed equation. He saw the elegant, simple steps required to unmake it. The knowledge was seductive, beautiful, and utterly damning. It whispered to him that God was a mathematical error that could be corrected. He fought against the blasphemous enlightenment, focusing on the simple, physical task. He took the loose thread, intending to stitch it back into place. But as he did, it crumbled into black dust in his fingers. The decay was too advanced. The prison was breaking. The other tapestries in the room began to stir. A low moan of despair seeped from the weeping vine of a sinner's envy. The cold ambition of the murderer's tapestry began to lower the room's temperature. The sins were waking up, drawn to the breach in the most powerful of their company. "It is too late for repair," Sister Elena cried, struggling to her feet. "The old thread is dead. The sin requires a new vessel. It requires a new sacrifice." With her guidance, Thomas understood the horrific truth. To mend the tapestry, he needed new thread, living thread. Guided by the last spinner's terrible knowledge, he performed the ritual. He took the consecrated golden needle, not to the tapestry, but to himself. He drew his own blood, scraped his own skin, pulled a lock of his own hair, and with Elena's ruined hands guiding his, he began to spin. The pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the spiritual agony as he wove his own life force, his own faith, into the thread. He then began to stitch the unraveling blasphemy, his own essence becoming the patch. With each stitch, he felt the cold, perfect logic of the sin recede from his mind, replaced by the dull, permanent throb of the tapestry's evil settling into his own soul. When the last stitch was made, the tower fell silent. The other tapestries grew dormant once more. The breach was sealed. Sister Elena gave him a look of profound pity and sorrow, and then, with her duty finally passed on, she crumbled into dust. Her long vigil ended. Brother Thomas was left alone in the silent tower. He was no longer a restorer of beauty. He was the warden of sins, the mender of souls. He was the last weaver, bound by his own sacrifice to a gallery of woven damnation, forever tasked with patching the prisons of evil with the threads of his own body and soul. Monsignor Giulio was a pragmatist. When he was appointed prefect of the Celarium Apostolicum, the papal cellars, he imagined his greatest challenges would be dust, mold, and ensuring the sacramental wine was of an acceptable vintage. He was a man of ledgers and logistics, not mysteries. That changed the day he discovered the locked iron door behind a false wall of wine racks. A door not marked on any blueprint. Forcing it open revealed a smaller, colder cellar, and its sole ancient guardian. Sister Immaculata was a relic herself, a woman who seemed to have been aged and preserved by the cellar's chill. She was blind, but her head would track Giulio's movements with unnerving accuracy. She was the last of the lacrimaria. An order so secret its existence was a whisper even in the deepest circles of the curia. Her confession, drawn from her over weeks of Giulio's gentle but persistent questioning, was more intoxicating and terrifying than any wine. The cellar did not store wine. it stored tears. For centuries, the lacrimaria were tasked with a sacred and gruesome duty, collecting the tears shed by saints, martyrs, and visionaries at the moment of their most profound spiritual experiences. The tear of a martyr at the stake, the tear of a mystic witnessing a divine apparition, the tear of a pope in the agony of holy doubt, all were collected using specially consecrated glass vials and brought to this cellar for aging. Tears are not merely salt and water, Monsignor. Immaculata's voice was a fragile, crystalline whisper. They are the soul made liquid, a distillation of the spirit. And like any fine vintage, their properties change over time. They mature. She explained the arcane theology behind the practice. The tears were categorized by their vintage, the year, their terroir, the saint who produced them, and their notes, the emotion that created them. A tear of ecstatic joy had a different spiritual effect than a tear of blessed sorrow. The collection was the Vatican's ultimate spiritual pharmacopoeia. A single, aged drop from a vial could grant a cardinal clarity of thought, imbue a missionary with unshakable faith, or give a dying pope a final vision of paradise. Giulio, though unnerved, saw the logic in it, however strange. It was a form of relic, concentrated and potent, but his pragmatism sensed a deeper, more unsettling secret. If these are for the holy, he asked, gesturing to the thousands of tiny, gleaming vials, then why is this cellar a secret, even from the Holy See itself? Immaculata's blind face seemed to crumple with a sorrow 1,000 years deep. Because, Monsignor, she whispered, not all the tears here are from saints. She led him to a small, isolated alcove, separated from the rest of the collection by a line of powdered salt. Here, the vials were not clear glass, but smoked, dark obsidian. The labels were not the names of saints, but of heretics, apostates, and the damned. The Church also has its enemies, she confessed. And sometimes their faith is formidable. When an exorcism is too difficult, when a heretic's will is too strong to be broken by conventional means, a more direct approach is needed. This was the cellar's true purpose. The lacrimaria were not just collectors, they were interrogators. When a subject was deemed spiritually unbreakable, they were brought to a chamber connected to the cellar. There, they were administered a single drop from one of the holy vials. But the effect on a soul devoid of grace was not inspiration. It was agony. A drop of a martyr's tear of faith would feel like holy fire in the veins of an apostate. A mystic's tear of divine love would induce a cataclysmic spiritual despair in one who had renounced God. We do not break their bodies, Immaculata said, a tear of her own tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. We break their souls. We distill their doubt, their hatred, their despair, into a single, perfect tear, the tear of the unsainted. These dark tears were the Vatican's most secret and terrible weapon. A single drop, administered to a rival, could sow the seeds of doubt in his heart. A vial, uncorked in an enemy cathedral, could poison its spiritual sanctity, causing faith to wither within its walls. It was a weapon of spiritual assassination. Giulio felt sick. This was not theology. It was a perversion of it. And you, sister, you have guarded this poison your whole life? I have done more than guard it, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The final stage of the aging process requires a catalyst. A living soul, steeped in faith, must act as a filter. For 70 years, I have sat in this cellar, and in my prayers, I have tasted them. She explained the final, horrifying ritual. Once a decade, the sommelier, the head of the lacrimaria, must conduct a tasting, not with the tongue, but with the soul. Through deep meditation, she would open her spirit to a single drop from each dark vial, absorbing a minuscule amount of its despair, its doubt, its agony. It was an act of spiritual filtration, purifying the concoction, but leaving the sommelier's own soul permanently stained, forever scarred with the spiritual taste of damnation. Her blindness, she confessed, was a mercy, a result of a tasting of a tear from a Cathar heretic who had claimed to have seen the face of the false god. Her eyes had burned out from the inside, As Giulio stared in horror, Immaculata began to tremble, a deep, rattling cough shaking her frail body. "My time is ending, Monsignor. And the cellar must have its keeper, the collection. It grows restless without a soul to anchor it." He could feel it then, a low, psychic hum from the obsidian vials, a chorus of despair, hatred, and agonizing doubt pressing against the glass, against his mind. The air grew thick with the spiritual stench of broken souls. "One vial has come of age," she gasped, pointing a trembling finger toward a small black vial on a velvet cushion. It was labeled simply Anti-Papa, the anti-pope. "Its vintage is ready. Its despair is perfect. It must be tasted. It must be filtered. Or it will break free." The pressure in Giulio's mind was immense, a tidal wave of hopelessness that threatened to drown his faith. He looked at the dying nun, at the vial of concentrated damnation, and understood the terrible choice she was presenting. The cellar needed a new sommelier. He could flee, leave the cellar to its fate, and let the poison leak into the heart of the Vatican. Or he could take up the burden, sacrifice his own soul to contain it, and spend eternity tasting tears of absolute despair. As Sister Immaculata breathed her last, the hum from the obsidian vials rose to a silent scream, and Monsignor Giulio, the man of logistics, uncorked the vial of the anti-pope and prepared for his first and last tasting. Dr. Aris Thorne was a geophysicist, a man who believed in seismic waves and ground-penetrating radar. The world, to him, was a series of measurable layers, from the crust to the core. So when the Vatican hired him under a veil of extreme secrecy, he assumed he was there to assess the structural integrity of the foundations beneath St. Peter's Basilica. He was right about the location, but wrong in a way that would shatter his scientific worldview about the nature of the survey. His liaison was Sister Joanna, a nun from a silent order whose face was perpetually hidden in the shadows of a deep cowl. She did not speak, but communicated through beautifully rendered architectural drawings and handwritten notes on parchment. She was, he learned, the last of the Planimetria Sancta, the holy cartographers. They led him to the ergastulum, a subcrypt level of the necropolis that was not on any official map. It was a labyrinth of unnatural angles and oppressive silence. His sensitive equipment, designed to map rock densities and subterranean voids, went haywire. The readings were impossible, showing pockets of space that seemed to absorb energy, areas where the laws of physics seemed to fray at the edges. Perplexed and frustrated, Aris confronted Sister Joanna, demanding an explanation for the anomalous data. It was then that she finally broke her vow of silence, and her confession redrew the map of his reality. "You are not mapping stone, Doctor," she said, her voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the very rock around them. "You are mapping wounds. The foundations of this holy place are built upon a site of immense spiritual power, but power, when focused, can be broken. Every schism, every great crisis of faith, every act of profound blasphemy committed within these walls has left a scar, not on history, but on the fabric of reality itself." She unrolled a vast, ancient map of the crypts. It was not a blueprint of stone and mortar, but a terrifyingly intricate chart of spiritual geography. The impossible spaces his equipment had detected were marked on her map. They were labeled loci vacui, empty places. "They are spiritual voids," she explained. "Pockets of non-existence, created when faith collapses under its own weight. A place where a pope lost his faith, for example, creates a vacuum. A conclave that descended into violent ambition creates a psychic dead zone. These voids are not empty. They are an absence of God, of grace, of meaning, and they are growing." The purpose of the holy cartographers, she confessed, was not to draw maps for builders, but to chart the spread of this spiritual cancer. They monitored the voids, measured their expansion, and performed rituals to reinforce the walls of reality around them. Aris's seismic equipment, she revealed, was picking up on the echoes of these voids, areas where reality was measurably thinner. The reason he had been summoned was a new, terrifying development. A new void had appeared, spontaneously, and it was behaving differently. It was not static. It was moving. It was hunting. Sister Joanna's last map showed its projected path, and it was heading directly for a sealed chamber at the heart of the ergastulum, the tomb of the first heretic. "We do not know his name," she said, leading Eris through the twisting, mind-bending corridors. "He was a disciple of St. Peter himself. He heard the gospel from the lips of the first pope, and yet he chose to believe the opposite. His doubt was so pure, so perfect, that it achieved a kind of anti-sainthood. When he died, his body could not be destroyed. It was sealed in a tomb, and his name was struck from every record. His tomb is not a shrine. It is an anchor for the concept of faithlessness. The moving void, she believed, was drawn to this anchor. If it reached the tomb and merged with the perfect doubt contained within, the resulting spiritual cataclysm could unravel the faith of the entire world. The very concept of belief would be swallowed by a void of absolute, unassailable doubt. They arrived at the tomb just as Eris's gravimeter plunged to zero. The air grew impossibly cold and still. A section of the far wall was no longer there. It hadn't crumbled. It had been replaced by a patch of perfect, featureless blackness that did not reflect light. It was a hole in the world. The void had arrived. From the featureless black, a shape began to emerge. It was not a monster of horns and claws, but something far worse, a perfect man. He was beautiful, his face radiating a profound, sorrowful intelligence. He was the physical manifestation of the first heretic, the perfect doubt given form. "Sister," the beautiful man said, his voice a melody of pure reason, "you have spent your life drawing lines around me, but lines are for children. The universe does not require them. It requires only truth." He looked at Eris, and Eris felt his lifetime of scientific certainty crumble. The man spoke no words, but filled Eris's mind with a torrent of elegant, undeniable proofs. He saw the cold, mathematical meaninglessness of the cosmos, the biological randomness of life, the neurological fiction of consciousness. Every belief he held, scientific or otherwise, was exposed as a comforting lie. There was no God. There was no soul. There was only the cold, beautiful, empty truth. "The map is not the territory," the heretic whispered in his mind. "It is time to erase it." But Sister Joanna stepped forward, holding not a crucifix, but a strange, astrolabe-like device of interlocking gold and silver rings. "We do not map what is, accursed one," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound power. "We map what must be. That is the nature of faith." She began to manipulate the device, twisting the rings and chanting in a language of pure geometry. She was not praying. She was reimposing the map. As she worked, Eris saw faint glowing lines of gold begin to appear in the air, forming a grid, a blueprint of reality, over the encroaching void. The heretic screamed, a sound of pure intellectual agony, as the illogical, irrational framework of faith was forced upon his perfect, logical emptiness. The void began to recede, the hole in the wall shrinking. But the strain on Sister Joanna was immense. Blood poured from her nose and ears. "Doctor," she cried, her voice strained. "The anchor. Your science is a belief system too. Use its anchor." Shaken from his nihilistic trance, Eris understood. He grabbed his most powerful seismic thumper, a device that sent powerful, resonant waves into the ground, and aimed it at the tomb. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he had to act. He cranked it to its maximum setting and fired. A low, powerful hum filled the crypt, the sound of empirical, measurable reality, the C-sharp of a vibrating earth, the pure, physical truth of the ground beneath their feet. The sound wave, a manifestation of physical law, slammed into the metaphysical void. The collision was silent but absolute. The heretic, caught between the imposed map of faith and the physical law of science, dissolved into dust. The void imploded, and the stone wall slammed back into existence with a deafening crack. Sister Joanna collapsed, the golden device shattering on the floor. Eris was left alone in the crypt, his ears ringing. He was a man of science who had witnessed a war between faith and nothingness. His instruments were now silent, their readings normal, but he knew the map of his world had been permanently, terrifyingly redrawn. He was no longer just a geophysicist. He was a cartographer now, aware of the voids that lay just beneath the surface of things, and the fragile lines that men and women of faith draw to keep them from swallowing the world. The letter arrived at the Vatican press office on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a trembling postal worker who claimed he'd found it slipped under his apartment door with no explanation. The envelope bore no postmark, no return address, only the papal seal pressed into black wax and the words, "For His Holiness's eyes only," written in Latin across cream-colored parchment. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti, prefect of the press office, broke the seal with practiced efficiency, expecting another crank letter or plea for intercession. Instead, he found himself reading the most disturbing document that had crossed his desk in 30 years of Vatican service. "Your Holiness, I write this confession knowing it may be my last act on this earth. The weight of what I have witnessed within these sacred walls has become unbearable, and I fear that my silence makes me complicit in horrors that defy both human understanding and divine mercy. My name is Sister Margherita Benedetti. I have served the Church faithfully for 43 years, the last 15 within the Vatican itself, assigned to the Apostolic Archive. What follows is my testimony, given freely and with full knowledge of the consequences I may face. It began 3 months ago. Sister Margherita's hands had always been steady, a blessing in her work, with ancient manuscripts and delicate papal documents. But on that humid July evening, they trembled as she descended into sublevel C of the Apostolic Archive, a section so restricted that only 7 people in the Vatican possessed access keys. She shouldn't have been there. Her authorization extended only to sublevel A, where she catalogued routine correspondence and historical documents. But Cardinal Bertoli had specifically requested that she retrieve a particular file from the deeper archives, something about 14th century land disputes that required immediate attention for a legal proceeding. The elevator's mechanical groaning seemed amplified in the narrow shaft as it carried her past sublevel B, past the climate-controlled chambers housing the Vatican's most precious manuscripts, down to depths she'd never imagined existed beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The doors opened with a pneumatic hiss onto a corridor that felt wrong somehow, too narrow, too cold, lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that cast sickly shadows on walls that seemed to curve inward. The air tasted metallic, tinged with something else she couldn't identify, but that made her stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. File cabinet 847C stood at the corridor's end, guarded by a door marked with symbols she didn't recognize alongside the traditional papal keys. Cardinal Bertoli's access code worked, and she found herself in a chamber that defied architectural logic circular, with filing cabinets arranged in concentric rings around a central area that dropped away into darkness. She found the requested file quickly enough. Disputes over monastery holdings, Avignon period, 1309, 1377. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight beam caught something that made her freeze. In the cabinet next to 847C, a drawer had been left slightly ajar. Inside, she glimpsed files with dates that shouldn't exist. 1960 to 1965, Project Magdalene. 1973, 1978, the Lourdes incidents. 1994, present, behavioral modifications. Her training in archival science warred with her curiosity. These files were clearly misfiled. Modern documents didn't belong in the historical section. As a conscientious archivist, shouldn't she at least check their proper classification? The Project Magdalene file felt heavier than it should, bound in leather that seemed to absorb her flashlight's beam. The contents made her wish she'd followed protocol and left immediately. From the classified records of Cardinal Secretary of State authorization level. Sanctum Sanctorum Project. Magdalene. Phase 1 report date. December 15, 1963. Following the Second Vatican Council's discussions on modernizing church practices, His Holiness authorized a select committee to investigate reports of supernatural phenomena occurring within various convents throughout Europe and the Americas. Initial findings suggest that certain religious communities have developed practices that extend beyond traditional Catholic doctrine. Of particular concern are reports from the convent of Santa Catalina in Peru, where local authorities have documented disappearances coinciding with the appearance of symbols carved into the convent's chapel walls. Sister Immaculata Rojas, the convent's Mother Superior, was brought to Rome for questioning in November 1963. Her confession, given under conditions of strict secrecy, reveals practices that she claims were revealed through divine visions, but which bear disturbing similarities to pre-Christian rituals documented in our archives of suppressed texts. The attached photographs document physical evidence recovered from Santa Catalina. I must stress that these images are not suitable for general viewing and should be restricted to those with appropriate theological and psychological preparation. Recommendation: immediate investigation of all convents and monasteries reported to have miraculous or unexplained phenomena. Establishment of Protocol 7 for dealing with communities that have deviated from approved practices. Signed, Cardinal Giuseppe Roncalli, later Pope John XXIII. Sister Margarita's hands shook as she turned to the photographs. The first few showed what appeared to be normal convent life: nuns at prayer, tending gardens, preparing meals. But as she progressed through the collection, the images became increasingly disturbing. Symbols carved into stone that seemed to writhe in the camera's flash. Nuns arranged in formations that hurt to look at directly, their faces bearing expressions of rapture that looked more like agony. And in the final photograph, something that made her drop the file entirely. The chapel at Santa Catalina, photographed from above. The pews had been removed, and the space was filled with what looked like a spiral pattern made of. She couldn't tell what. The quality of the 1960s photograph made details indistinct, but the pattern seemed to descend into the floor itself, as if the stone had been carved away to create a funnel leading down into darkness. Standing around the spiral's edge were figures in religious habits, but something was wrong with their proportions. They seemed too tall, too thin, and their faces, even in the grainy black and white photo, appeared to lack certain features that should have been there. Sister Margarita gathered the scattered papers with shaking hands, her mind reeling. This had to be some kind of historical documentation of past heresies, surely. The Church had always been vigilant against corruption and false practices. These files were probably evidence of problems that had been resolved decades ago. But as she returned the Project Magdalene file to its drawer, she noticed other files, hundreds of them, with dates ranging from the 1960s to last month. Whatever had been discovered at Santa Catalina was not a historical aberration. It was ongoing. She should have left then, should have returned to Sublevel A, filed her report about retrieving the requested documents, and tried to forget what she'd seen. Instead, she found herself opening another drawer, then another. The Lourdes Incidents file contained correspondence between various bishops and the Vatican's Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The letters spoke of anomalous healing patterns and pilgrims who returned changed. There were medical reports documenting miraculous cures that had one disturbing commonality: every healed individual subsequently reported vivid dreams of the Lady beneath the grotto. One letter from Bishop Marcel Dubois of Tarbes was particularly troubling. Your Eminence, I write regarding the 17 pilgrims who experienced miraculous healing at Lourdes during the August pilgrimage season. While we naturally celebrate these manifestations of divine grace, certain aspects of their recovery warrant your attention. All 17 individuals report identical dreams following their healing. They speak of being called beneath the Lady's shrine, where they encounter the true Mother, who shows them what lies beneath the world. These dreams appear to be more than mere psychological phenomena. Several pilgrims have been found sleepwalking toward the grotto in the early morning hours, requiring restraint by medical staff. More concerning is the discovery of symbols carved into the stone beneath the spring. Our maintenance staff found them during routine cleaning, though they insist the carvings were not present during previous inspections. The symbols match those documented in your 1962 circular regarding deviant iconography in religious communities. I have ordered the area sealed until you can send investigators. The miraculous healings continue, but I fear we may be dealing with something that transcends our understanding of divine intervention. In Christ, Bishop Marcel Dubois, Attached to the letter were photographs of the symbols. They were the same ones Sister Margarita had seen in the Santa Catalina documentation, but somehow more elaborate, as if they had grown or evolved over the intervening years. The behavioral modifications file was the thickest, containing reports from dozens of religious communities worldwide. Each described similar patterns. Nuns or monks reporting enhanced spiritual experiences, the appearance of previously unknown texts or symbols, and gradually changing practices that deviated from approved liturgy. What made Sister Margarita's blood run cold was the realization that she recognized some of the locations mentioned in the most recent reports. The Convent of the Sacred Heart in Dublin, where her friend Sister Catherine served. The Monastery of St. Jerome in New Mexico, which she'd visited just 2 years ago during a research exchange. And then she saw it. Convento della Santa Croce, Vatican City. Her own convent. The report, dated just 3 weeks ago, was brief but chilling. Subject: Observational Report. Convento della Santa Croce Classification. Urgent Observer. Agent M.R. Deep Cover. The Sisters of the Holy Cross have begun exhibiting Pattern 7 behaviors consistent with other compromised communities. Morning prayers now include recitations in an unidentified language that predates Latin. Several sisters report visions of the true doctrine during meditation. Of particular concern is the construction of what appears to be a secondary chapel in the convent's sub-basement. Sister Superior Francesca claims it is for deeper contemplation, but architectural analysis suggests the space has been designed to match specifications found in the Magdalene files. Recommend immediate intervention before Pattern 7 reaches completion. Previous communities that reached this stage could not be safely extracted. Agent MR requests permission to maintain cover until primary subject is identified. Sister Margarita's mind reeled. Someone was watching her convent, documenting their activities as if they were subjects in an experiment. And whoever had written this report was still there, pretending to be one of her sisters while secretly observing them all. But more terrifying was the reference to a secondary chapel in the sub-basement. She'd lived in the convent for 15 years and had never heard mention of any sub-basement, let alone a secondary chapel. The building's basement contained only storage rooms, the laundry facilities, and the maintenance area, the section that Sister Superior Francesca had declared off-limits 6 months ago, claiming it was being renovated for improved spiritual facilities. Sister Margarita's return journey to Sublevel A passed in a blur of horror and confusion. Her mind struggled to process what she'd discovered, to find some rational explanation that wouldn't shatter her faith and worldview entirely. She tried to convince herself that the files were elaborate fakes, perhaps part of some test of loyalty or psychological study. But the bureaucratic thoroughness of the documentation, the official seals and letterheads, the photographic evidence, all of it bore the hallmarks of authentic Vatican record-keeping that she'd learned to recognize over decades of archival work. That night, she lay in her narrow convent bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around her. But now every creak seemed ominous. Every whisper of wind through the corridors might be concealing other sounds, footsteps, voices, or worse. Near midnight, she heard singing. It was coming from somewhere below, muffled by stone and distance, but unmistakably human voices raised in harmony. But the melody was wrong. The cadence unlike any hymn or chant she'd ever learned. The notes seemed to follow patterns that made her teeth ache, harmonies that her ear insisted shouldn't work but somehow did. Sister Margarita crept from her bed and pressed her ear to the floor. The singing was definitely coming from beneath the building, from somewhere deeper than the basement level she knew. As she listened, she began to make out words, not Latin or Italian, but something older, something that seemed to bypass her rational mind and speak directly to a part of her brain that recoiled in instinctive terror. The singing continued for over an hour, rising and falling in intensity, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like responses from a larger group. When it finally stopped, the silence felt oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. The next morning brought the discovery that changed everything. Sister Margarita was returning from early morning mass when she found Sister Catherine waiting in her cell. But something was wrong with her friend's appearance. Her skin had a waxy quality, and her eyes held an intensity that seemed almost feverish. "Margarita," Sister Catherine said, her voice carrying an odd resonance, Mother Superior Francesca wants to see you. She has something wonderful to show you." "What kind of wonderful thing?" Sister Margarita asked, though every instinct screamed at her to make an excuse and leave immediately. Sister Catherine's smile was too wide, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "The truth," she said. "The real truth about our calling. About what we're really meant to serve." Sister Margarita followed Sister Catherine through corridors she'd walked thousands of times, but now they seemed subtly different. The angles wrong somehow, the shadows falling in directions that defied the position of the windows. Other sisters they passed smiled and nodded, but their expressions held that same feverish intensity she'd seen in Catherine's eyes. They descended past the main basement level, through a door that Sister Margarita would have sworn was just a maintenance closet the day before. Beyond it lay stairs carved from stone that looked far older than the rest of the building, leading down into depths that shouldn't exist beneath the Vatican. The secondary chapel was exactly what the files had described, and worse than she could have imagined. The space was circular, with walls covered in symbols that seemed to move in her peripheral vision. The floor sloped downward toward a central area where the stone had been carved away to create a spiral pattern that descended into darkness. Around the spiral's edge, dozens of her sister nuns knelt in prayer, their voices raised in the same haunting melody she'd heard the night before. But they were wrong. All of them were wrong in ways that her mind struggled to process. Their proportions seemed off, as if they were being viewed through a distorting lens. Their habits hung strangely on bodies that no longer seemed entirely human, and their faces. Sister Superior Francesca stood at the spiral's center, her arms raised toward the ceiling. She turned as Sister Margarita entered, and her smile was radiant with a joy that looked like madness. "Sister Margarita," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "We've been waiting for you. The lady beneath has been calling your name." "What lady?" Sister Margarita whispered, though she dreaded the answer. "The true mother," Sister Superior Francesca replied. "The one who was here before the Father, before the Son, before the false light that blinds us to deeper truths. She's been waiting so patiently for her children to remember their real purpose." The singing grew louder, and Sister Margarita realized that the voices were coming not just from the nuns around the spiral, but from the darkness at its center. Something was responding from the depths, harmonizing with the human voices in tones that no human throat could produce. "We serve a lie," Sister Superior Francesca continued, her eyes now completely black, reflecting no light. "A construct designed to keep us from our true calling. But she remembers us. She's always remembered us. And now, finally, we can remember her." Sister Catherine placed a hand on Sister Margarita's shoulder, and the touch burned like ice. "It doesn't hurt," she whispered. "The change doesn't hurt. It feels like coming home after a long, terrible dream." Sister Margarita looked around the circle of her transformed sisters and saw her own fate reflected in their altered faces. Whatever was happening here had been happening slowly, gradually transforming the women she'd lived and prayed with for years into something that served a purpose antithetical to everything they'd once believed. She thought of the files she'd read, the communities across the world that had undergone this same transformation. How many convents and monasteries now served this lady beneath, while maintaining the facade of Christian devotion? How deep did this corruption go within the church itself? "I need to pray about this," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. This is a lot to process." Sister Superior Francesca nodded understandingly. "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need, but don't take too long. The lady is eager to meet you properly, and her patience, while vast, is not infinite." Sister Margarita spent the next 3 days in a state of barely controlled terror, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy while planning her escape. She couldn't go to the Vatican authorities. The files she'd seen made it clear that at least some officials were aware of what was happening and were either powerless to stop it or complicit in its continuation. She couldn't simply flee. Where could a nun go that the church couldn't find her? And besides, if these transformations were happening globally, running might only deliver her into the hands of another corrupted community. Her only hope was to document everything she'd discovered and find a way to get that information to someone who might be able to act on it. But who could she trust? How could she distinguish between genuine church officials and those who might be part of whatever conspiracy allowed these horrors to continue? The answer came to her during morning mass on the third day. Cardinal Toretti, visiting from the press office, was conducting the service. She'd met him several times during her archival work and had always been impressed by his genuine piety and intellectual honesty. If anyone might listen to her story and act appropriately, it would be him. But approaching him directly was impossible. Too many of her transformed sisters would observe the interaction. Instead, she would have to find another way to get her testimony into his hands. That night, she began writing her confession, working by candlelight to avoid detection by whatever surveillance methods might be monitoring the convent's electrical systems. She documented everything she'd seen, from the files in sublevel C to the horrific chapel beneath her feet. She described the transformation of her sister nuns and the implications of what she'd learned about similar communities worldwide. As she wrote, she could hear the nightly singing from below, now accompanied by sounds that definitely weren't human. Something was growing stronger down there, fed by the corrupted devotion of women who'd given their lives to serve what they believed was God, but had instead become vessels for something far older and more terrible. On the fourth night, Sister Catherine came to her cell again. "The lady has been asking about you," she said, her transformed features now openly inhuman in the candlelight. "She wonders why you haven't come to receive her blessing." "I'm still praying for guidance," Sister Margarita replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her terror. Sister Catherine tilted her head at an angle that would have broken a normal person's neck. "She says you've been asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering whether to accept her gift, you should be asking why you're afraid of it." "I'm not afraid," Sister Margarita lied. "I just want to be certain I'm truly being called to this deeper service." "Come with me," Sister Catherine said, extending a hand that now ended in claws rather than fingernails. "Let her show you what she's offering. Let her explain why the old ways were never meant to last." Sister Margarita knew that if she went down to that spiral chapel again, she wouldn't return as herself. Whatever process was transforming, the other nuns would claim her as well, and her confession would never reach anyone who might be able to act on it. "Tomorrow," she said, "after I complete my final prayers to the Father, I want to say goodbye to the old way properly." Sister Catherine's smile revealed rows of teeth that were definitely no longer human. "Tomorrow, then, the lady will be so pleased." Sister Margarita completed her confession as dawn broke over the Vatican. She sealed it in an envelope addressed to Cardinal Toretti, then made her way to the convent's main entrance. For the first time in 15 years, she walked out without permission, knowing she would never return. She had no plan beyond getting her testimony into the right hands. She had no money, no civilian clothes, nowhere to go, but staying would mean joining whatever her sisters had become, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing herself to serve the thing in the darkness beneath. The postal worker who found her letter under his door would later report that he'd discovered it there, along with a nun's habit, neatly folded. The security footage from nearby buildings showed no one approaching his apartment, and Sister Margarita Benedetti was never seen again. Her testimony sparked a secret investigation that Cardinal Toretti conducted personally, using resources and authority that officially didn't exist. What he found corroborated her account and revealed that the problem was even worse than she'd suspected. The lady beneath had been awakening religious communities to her presence for decades, perhaps centuries. Convents and monasteries across the globe had been gradually transformed into centers of worship for something that predated Christianity by millennia. The Church had been aware of the problem since at least the 1960s, but had been either unable or unwilling to address it effectively. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that the transformation process was accelerating. Communities that once took years to fully convert were now changing within months. Something was calling these ancient forces to greater activity, and the Church's attempts at containment were failing. Cardinal Toretti's investigation file, classified at the highest levels of Vatican security, concluded with a recommendation that was never implemented: complete evacuation and consecration of all affected religious communities, regardless of the question such dramatic action might raise. Instead, the file was buried in the same sub-basement archives where Sister Margarita had first discovered the truth. It joined thousands of other documents that detailed the Church's ongoing struggle against forces that its public doctrine insisted didn't exist.